will begin in a minute. Thank you.
Well, good morning, everybody, and thanks for being back promptly this morning. And thanks again for the contribution that everybody made yesterday to a very lively and important and meaningful discussion on a number of topics. I wanted to start off with just one item this morning on a question that was raised by one of the members yesterday, and I said we'd follow up on it. So a question was raised as to the timing of the issuance by the board of a Rule 4010 report that would summarize inspection findings, 2013 inspection findings of 2012 audits. And the point was made that it would be helpful if that were out pretty soon, as that might help in planning in connection with the upcoming year-end audits. So the answer to that question is the date of that issuance is uncertain for a number of reasons, including thoughts to possibly combine a couple of years together in that 4010 report so that trends can be seen over time in terms of what the inspectors are seeing and are there improvements from years to year, et cetera. But that's just a consideration, so the date is uncertain. However, I will point out a few other things that were mentioned by the inspectors to me. They will summarize at the December conference, which is attended widely, the AICPA's December conference at the SEC, FASB, and PCAOB. They will summarize inspection findings broadly at that meeting and make a report on that. So that should be useful. But they point out equally importantly that each firm has received its own inspection report on 2012 audits and the 2013 inspection, and that the firms have had extensive discussions with the inspectors about those findings and the remediation needed within your own firm. And the point being that, of course, it's not sufficient just to remediate the audits that were looked at that had deficiencies, but to consider those deficiencies from a firm-wide perspective and how they could be and need to be addressed. And that's probably the most important priority. Another aspect was that a large number of the findings in 2013, and a big reason for the spike in findings, were problems with respect to audits in connection with internal control over financial reporting. And a 4010, well, first of all, firms had their own findings in that regard, number one. But two, a 4010 report was issued broadly with respect to the overall findings on audits of internal control over financial reporting. And as I mentioned yesterday, we also recently put out a practice alert in ways in which firms might think about improving their audits in that regard. So our inspection's thought is that there is a lot out there already for the firms to chew on and work on in connection with things that need to be remediated firm-wide and addressed as part of planning for the 2013 year-end audits. But in addition, there will be a discussion of the broader findings, across all firms at the December AICPA conference. So I just wanted to share that response. With that, I'll now turn it back over to Jennifer Rand and Jessica Watts and Lillian Sanoa and Elena Bashkova to talk about the audit reporting model.
Thank you, Marty. Good morning, everyone. As Marty said, we'll continue our discussion on the auditor's reporting model. Before we do that, though, I want to remind you of our disclaimer, which is the views expressed by each of the presenters are our own personal views and not necessarily those of the PCAOB, members of the board, or other PCAOB staff. So getting into our discussion. Yesterday, we spent our time, and our time had been abbreviated, but we did discuss critical audit matters. Your feedback was very helpful. I think we may have time today if anybody has any further comments regarding that toward the end of the session. But our focus to start off with is on the new elements of the report and the other information standard that's included in the PCAOB's proposals. Since we're back on schedule and we have time, we thought it would be helpful before we just open up the floor for discussion to provide an overview of the standards, and then we'll get into the discussion. And then, of course, I expect we'll have time at the end if there's anything else that wasn't covered that's of interest. Certainly would like to hear your views on that as well. So with that, I'll turn it over to Jessica.
Thank you. As I mentioned yesterday, the proposed standard, in addition to critical audit matters, includes new elements, specifically independence and auditor tenure. Related to independence, the proposed standard would require the auditor to include a statement in the auditor's report that the auditor is a public accounting firm registered with the PCAOB and is required to be independent with respect to the company in accordance with the United States federal securities laws and the applicable rules and regulations of the SEC and the PCAOB. Under PCAOB and SEC rules, the auditor is required to be independent of the company. This statement in the auditor's report is intended to enhance investors' understanding about the auditor's obligations to be independent and to serve as a reminder to auditors of these obligations. Related to tenure, the proposed auditor reporting standard would require the auditor to include in the auditor's report a statement containing the year that the auditor began serving as the company's auditor. Currently, this information is not required to be communicated by the auditor, management, or the audit committee to investors or other financial statement users. Auditor tenure has been a subject of discussion for decades, and investors and others have indicated strong interest in this information. In light of the public interest, we proposed auditor tenure as a data point in the auditor's report. The intent of the proposed requirement is to disclose the duration of the auditor's relationship with the company. And then the next thing we'll talk about is the other information standard. So during the board's outreach process, some commenters had indicated that they would support changes to the auditor's report that describe the auditor's responsibilities related to other information and the auditor's conclusions related to the other information. And in order to provide a basis to better explain to investors the auditor's responsibilities related to that other information and the auditor's conclusions, we determined that changes to the existing other information standard were appropriate to provide a specific basis for this description in the auditor's report. As a result of this link between the proposed auditor reporting standard and the proposed other information standard, the financial statement user would obtain useful information such as the nature and scope of the auditor's responsibility with respect to other information, clarification of what other information was evaluated by the auditor, and a description of the results of the auditor's evaluation of the other information. The other information standard specifically applies to a company's annual reports filed with the SEC under the Exchange Act that contain the company's audited financial statements and the related auditor's report. Next slide.
I switched it.
Oh, no, next slide.
Oh.
Thank you. Oh, no, sorry. You're right. You did switch it early. The proposed other information standard would require the auditor to evaluate whether the other information contains a material inconsistency, a material misstatement of fact, or both, based on relevant audit evidence obtained and conclusions reached during the audit. In addition to reading this other information, the auditor's evaluation of the proposed other information standard would include performing procedures intended to help the auditor identify whether the other information contains a material misstatement of fact or a material inconsistency. The proposed other information standard provides specific responses when the auditor identifies a material inconsistency or a material misstatement of fact, or both, such as communication with management and further procedures as necessary. So now I'll turn it back to Jennifer to start our discussion.
Okay, thank you. So to start off, we'd like to talk about the new elements in the report, specifically the element regarding independence, statement from the auditor about independence, and also on auditor tenure. I see Loretta. Loretta, go ahead.
Good morning. On the independence, I don't have an issue. On the auditor tenure, I guess my question is, as I read this, it seems to be far-reaching backwards, particularly with predecessor firms, because as we know, audit firms have merged over the years. And I'm really, one of the things I really would like to hear from investors is how relevant all of that is, because, you know, if you've been audited by the same firm for 15 years, 20 years, 30 years, I mean, when does that really strike them as a hot button? Because, you know, going all the way back, you have a different management, different partner, different firm, having previously, you know, been with Main Herdman and then, you know, KMG. I can tell you that when they merged with KPMG, it was a different auditing set of processes. So I'm not sure how relevant the predecessor firm is. And also, you know, the fact is that if we're looking for independence, when you have different management teams and different auditors and audit firms, again, I don't think you have that independence issue as striking. But I am interested to know if there is a cutoff by which investors believe that, you know, it would be satisfactory to say they've been our auditors over 25 years, rather than going all the way back.
Okay, thank you. I think it'd be helpful to get some other views on this topic, and we can go back and respond. But Galen Hansen?
Yes, if I could comment on both of these. Auditor independence. So certainly the audit report is titled Report of Independent Registered Public Accounting Firm, so there's a sort of an implied conclusion that the firm is independent. It's interesting that the way the paragraph is written. It says that the auditors are required to be independent. It doesn't actually say that they are independent, and I understand the argument that there's violations, a lot of times very minor, that are resolved with the SEC or with actions as taken so that the firm can be independent during the course of the audit. But for me, it's sort of a disconnect. If the auditor can't say affirmatively that they are independent, I think there's an expectations gap problem with that in the report itself. So I would like to see a stronger statement here, and I'm not sure exactly. Well, I don't know that I have the solution for that, but we have to make it clear that the auditor is independent in the way that it's communicated to users. And then on tenure, I don't particularly have any problem at all with the disclosure of that. It seems to me that, and the issue's been raised with me by others. It's maybe important as to any implications as to tenure on independence, and the placement of that in the report could be important. If it's next to the discussion of independence, maybe there's an implication that if there's some period of time that you've been the auditor, that you're raising issues about independence. So I think we need to be careful about the placement and the manner in which it is disclosed. Thanks.
Galen, did you have any thoughts about placement, it sounded like you thought an alternative might be preferable. Just didn't hear if you had made a suggestion or any thoughts.
The suggestion that has been made to me was that if it could be made, if the statement about tenure is not in the independence paragraph, it would be preferred. And maybe right near the end of the report, somewhere near the auditor signature line.
Thank you. Bob Hirth?
Thanks. Jennifer, to pile on the tenure comment, I had polled a number of CFOs and audit committee members, and I got some consistent comments around tenure, and let me just kind of read you the sense of one. I don't like the proposal to disclose audit tenure. It would be or is out of context being placed directly in the auditor's report, and for long-serving auditors implies a taint on their independence, which I believe is unfair. We have independence rules, and either the auditor complies or not, irrespective of the tenure. To add on to that, one option around placement would be to put it in the proxy where there is discussion about the auditor and approval of the auditor, and you could put it there. Now, whether that's, Bob and I were talking, whether that's voluntary and suggested and companies just decide to do that, or it's a requirement. So that's a comment on tenure.
Okay, thank you. Elizabeth Mooney?
Thanks. I didn't get a chance to make some comments yesterday, so I have a couple as well that might relate to yesterday's discussion, a couple comments. Just on the tenure, from my discussions with analysts, they are interested in knowing how long the auditor has been in place on an engagement with the company, but I can't say there's a consensus around how many years, but they are very interested in that time frame. And I wouldn't make a blanket statement that it's a taint. I just think it's helping to educate the investors, and so. But it is something they like to know. And we have gone back and tried to piece it together with annual reports we can get our hands on. The analysts have asked me to do that. So I would just say it is relevant, and I don't see why it's a fact. It's a discernible fact, and where it is. I mean, I don't see why it would be a problem in the auditor's report. But on just another general comment, we talked a little bit about IAASB's proposal yesterday, and I just would encourage PCAOB not to wait. Convergence has been a slow process, and just be a leader and do what the board thinks is the best thing, and hopefully convergence will happen naturally. In terms of what information would be especially useful, I think one important piece is the risk assessment and how it changed during this year or this audit from the prior period or periods, and the biggest risks and how the auditors responded to them, how much time is spent on them, how they got comfortable with them, any significant adjustments to the work they did. That's kind of thing that would be really useful. And again, it's about the audit. And in terms of reporting the critical matters, I just encourage you to make sure that the standards are strong enough. It should be really based on what's required, what is significant according to the audit standards. I think this came up in your IAG meeting, but I think that's really important so that you can have some consistency, and that it'll be actually an enforceable standard. And on the other information, outside the financial statements, I think if auditors know that investors are getting certain, bad information, and it's their responsibility to say something. So I think that, to fix it or do something, that makes a ton of sense. Thanks.
So before we there's a lot of other cards up, thought we'd pause just for a second because a lot of comments were made, and maybe I'll add some color and see if that helps or not. So the thought on the tenure, because a lot of points have been made that it's not relevant and firms have merged and the different partners change every so many years, and therefore, to some, it's not meaningful, or some said it taints. When we had hearings around the concept release on auditor independence, objectivity, and professional skepticism, including rotation, there were a lot of people who testified at those hearings and talked about concerns about long tenure, but at the same time, there were some people that testified and said they're concerned about rotation because they think the riskiest audits are in year one. And so there were a lot of points that came out of those hearings about pro and con rotation, but risks in both directions. And so the thought on putting in tenure was, well, for those investors who think it's very risky in year one of a new audit, for an auditor that really isn't up to speed potentially on all the issues in the company, that's a valuable data point for that investor that has that concern. And there are those others who are concerned that, 120-year relationships, even though partners do change and firms merge, firms tend to value in a certain way their 100-year relationship clients or long-term clients. And there's probably some pressure on the audit partner besides just doing a good audit, to not be the partner that loses that client that's been a client of the firm and a crown jewel of the firm for 100 years. So there's enough pressure doing the audit itself, but to be the partner who's going to make tough calls that might cause losing the client puts extra pressure on him. So maybe investors want to know about those relationships because they feel those partners are under a unique kind of pressure. So tenure really was thought to be a data point of value, whether it's the first year of an audit or the 100th year of the relationship, or somewhere in between. But the comments you're making, I think, are some of the comments we've heard across the board. Some people think it's not valuable, and other investors have said we think it's a valuable data point. So I thought I'd just add a little color on. We're not just pointing out the lengthy tenure. It's whatever it is that could be potentially of value. With respect to the comment on independence and the fact that we are required to, as opposed to we are independent, I think, Galen, you touched on the exact issue, and that is some firms have violations of independence rules during the audit, and if they have a violation, that might affect that they violated the rules that year. So the statement is written in a certain context. I think that we'll continue to explore that because I think your reaction is a fair one, and I think others have that, but I think it's something we have to work through. So thought I'd just add those points as we take the rest of the comments. I don't know, Jennifer, did you have any other additional reactions to what was made? Okay, thanks.
Okay, next on my list is Steve Buller.
Thank you. Just a couple thoughts again as a user. So we rely upon the audit firm to tell us if they're independent. It's hard for a user to understand if an audit firm is or is not independent. And the additional disclosure is not really meaningful information which is actionable for us as an investor, merely stating that they are independent. I guess while we have the SEC in the room, the thing I would encourage, actually, which probably is of more benefit to us, is to have a full review of the auditor independence rules, because between the investment company complex rules, the 21010 over-under rules, the former partner pension rules, they're difficult for the audit firms. They're difficult for users also. We have 2 full-time people who spend all their time, 100%, monitoring auditor independence with contracts and relationships and former personnel. But also, it's apparent to us at least that there is going to be a higher degree of auditor rotation. Now, whether that's 1% or 20%, I don't know. But unless someone goes back and just looks at the issue of former partner pension plans and unfunded pensions, as we have more and more former partners who serve on boards, including our board. If there are rotations, we're going to see more required changes because of partner pension plans and taints as they bring in new audit firms. So I just encourage the SEC to look at that as part of this longer-term project. With respect to audit tenure, we don't object to disclosure of the number of years in which the firm has served as the auditor. Again, the question is what's actionable for us. So for us, we think it probably makes more sense to have that disclosure in a proxy in the auditor opinion, and here's why. if we think that there's a problem with the auditor independence or the number of years they served, the way we take action is by voting in a proxy to not reappoint the auditor. It's hard for us to take action when we review financial statements to understand what it means and the impact upon financial statements if they've been an auditor for 1 year or 50 years. It's just not something that, goes into our analysis of the integrity of those financial statements. It probably belongs in our decision-making of whether or not to retain the auditor. So those are a few comments.
Thanks for those comments, Steve. They're very helpful. I think actually a couple of them, though, were really for the SEC more than us. And somebody else also had mentioned earlier that they thought that, maybe it was Bob Hirth, who mentioned that he thought that if tenure is going to be disclosed, it should be disclosed in the proxy rather than in the audit report. So that's outside of the scope of our authority again, but we take that point and appreciate that. So the SEC has heard your views.
Okay, Professor Cox?
So it was my pleasure, although it interrupted a vacation, to testify give some testimony at the roundtable on auditor rotation in San Francisco a couple of years ago. And my actually eagerness to do that was informed by the fact that before I even had the opportunity to do that, I started looking at the literature about what the implications are on the question of independence and tenure. And I was astounded, sort of like a Goldilocks situation, and that testimony is all a matter of record. People could look at the studies that have been done, and which I think I tried to correctly summarize. But it really is a Goldilocks moment because it's sort of like a question about it's either too short or it's too long, and how the empiricists have been able to document the problems arose from this. And the studies all indicate the following: that it's very hard to figure out what's just right, okay? And we moved past the question of mandatory rotation of audit firms, at least at this moment in time. But it does make me think that what we'd like to do is shine a light on this problem. Because the problems are not only at too short a tenure, but the problems also exist, again, with some statistical significance, with too long a tenure. And the whole function of what we're talking about starting yesterday afternoon and continuing this morning is where is an appropriate place to shine a light on this. And some things probably need to be centralized and located in one place. We all know that when you change an auditor, that's an 8K filing that you have to make with the SEC. But there are some other things we may want to think about as well, and that there is a central location of this very ever-growing set of financial statements where we'd like to have some things just highlighted. And I think auditor tenure is one of those. So I think that just specifying what the length of the tenure is in the audit statement, in a very crisp statement, can at least shine a light on it and let investors do what they want with it. Some have staffs of 2 people who do nothing more than that. I'm going to suggest that a lot of investors don't fall into that category. But by being able to highlight it, maybe they can dig into the question more likely and figure out what to make of the question about too short or too long a tenure.
Thank you. Rick Murray?
Thank you, Jennifer. I think there's a terminological problem that requires some further attention. The concept of being independent really is 2 separate thoughts. One is the condition of being independent, which is generally speaking capable of objective identification and explanation. The other is the way of doing things, which is a process, a state of mind, and a far more subjective and nuanced issue. I don't think it's clear in the materials whether one or both of those uses of the word are clearly intended. Seems to me there are places where you would imply one thought attaching to the way independence is used, other places where it seems more to be the other. So I would encourage a review of the drafting process so that whichever of those the board intends to be the purpose of independence for this purpose is clearly specified. Second, and a briefer comment, there's a catch-22 here in that for 40 years there's been a debate about whether it is possible, at least theoretically, to be independent when being compensated by the client. And there are clearly many voices who continue to believe that it's not, and that it is a misrepresentation, if you will, for an audit firm to declare itself to be independent in the current context of the way compensation is arranged. For those voices, some in academia, some in a variety of other communities, the use of litigation as a tool to challenge that alleged misrepresentation and to use this new element of the audit report to accuse the firm of overtly misrepresenting their status as independent, if that is the way that the board elects to use the word, is an unintended consequence that I think needs some attention. It can be clarified by defining a little more closely what the standards are that are being used for that purpose. But when you ask the auditor to make a self-declaration of that, it ought to be clear whether the declaration is one of status or of process, and how that can be recognized by the regulator as an accurate statement in light of the compensation arrangement.
I'd like to explore that a little bit, Rick, if we can. Those are very interesting comments. I think the first thought is, by including a statement in the audit report that we are required to be independent according to the rules of the SEC and the PCAOB, our intent in drafting that and putting it in the report was we thought that that had a chance of increasing the auditors' thinking about their decisions, that they had to be independent of mind and had that objectivity in the decisions they were making as they were coming to their conclusion on the financial statements. It might have that intangible benefit of increasing that independent state of mind that you talked about. That's one of the couple of aspects of independence. I think that's the main reason for putting that there. We'd also like to put in the statement we are independent, to Galen's point, but there's some other technical issues with that. But I'd like to explore what you meant by this has a liability and litigation issue and overtly misrepresenting the auditor's position. So maybe you could share with us a little bit more your thoughts in that regard.
First and most simply, Marty, if it's clearly the intent of the board that the reference in the audit report is to the state of mind, the process, rather than the status of independence, that goes a long way. If that's clarified, that goes a long way to take both of my comments out of play.
Well, it didn't mean to say it ignores the fact that we had to comply with rules as well, and that we're required to comply with rules. But certainly, there's the two aspects of the rules and the state of mind.
I may be wrong factually on this, but it's my impression that neither the SEC nor the PCAOB have ever overtly said, we have examined the nature of the compensation of auditors in this system of financial reporting, and we have concluded that that does not impair the auditor's ability to function independently. If that were to be clarified and the declaration in the audit report were to fit into that model saying we have functioned independently, I think that reconciles the problem. It's the overhang of a historical and not formally resolved question about the effective compensation, coupled with asking the auditor to make a self-declaration that if claimed to be materially misleading, which is certainly within the reach of trial lawyers these days, that creates the concern.
Thanks. I'd be interested in others' reactions to that, but I understand the point you're saying, that potentially the client pays model creates a conflict that inherently affects independence, and therefore making that declaration raises the point that you're concerned about. I don't know if anybody has a reaction to that, but if they do, hope to hear from it as part of the discussion.
Okay, thank you. Jeff Mahoney.
Thank you. I just wanted to agree with the staff statement that there is strong investor interest in the tenure information. That's reflected in our corporate governance policies in at least two ways. First, with respect to share owners' oversight of the audit committee, our policies related to audit committees indicate that tenure should be a factor that the audit committee looks at with respect to the retention issue.
Jeff, I'm sorry, we were getting, obviously, you're hearing that noise, but I was missing some of what you were saying. It was quite distracting. Seems like it's subsided. If you could just repeat that again, I apologize. I don't want to miss your point.
Sure. I wanted to express my agreement with the staff statement that there is a strong interest by investors in the tenure information. That's reflected in our corporate governance policies in two different areas. First, with respect to shareholders' oversight of the audit committee, in our policies related to the audit committee, we do say that the audit committee should look at auditors' tenure as one of many factors when considering auditor retention issues. In addition, we ask for disclosure by the audit committee when the auditor has been retained for 10 consecutive years or more, that there be some additional disclosure by the committee about that decision to retain the same auditor beyond the 10-year period. It also has relevance with respect to our policies, which many public companies have adopted with respect to the annual share owner vote on the ratification of the external auditor, where we believe that the tenure of the auditor should be one factor, again, not necessarily the most important factor, but one factor that share owners should look at when making that retention vote, which, as I indicated, it is very common at a large number of public companies. With respect to where the information is disclosed, we do not have a policy saying that the tenure information should be disclosed in the auditor's report or in the proxy statement. I can see the argument that it be disclosed in the proxy, but I'm not aware of anyone in our membership who would be upset if that information was disclosed in the auditor's report, which is the main vehicle of communication between the external auditor and share owners, rather than in the proxy statement. In addition, I think if you ask them, if it's disclosed in the auditor's report, you may get this information in a shorter period of time. You may get this information in a few years. If it's disclosed in the proxy, it may be a long time before you ever get that information. If you add that to the conversation, I think a number of our members would agree or support the idea of having tenure disclosed in the auditor's report if they think they're more likely to get that information sooner rather than later. Thank you.
Thank you, Jeff. Bob Guido.
Thank you. I just wanted to pick up on a couple of points, especially there goes the hammer. But what Steve Bowler said about independence, And not to dwell on this issue too much, but go back to the premise that we audit committees spend a lot of time in this area, and we do challenge. And I'd like to just remind everyone that tenure from an audit committee's perspective is 1 year at a time, which means the firms have to prove themselves not only in performance on an annual basis, but in the independence, objectivity, et cetera, fact and state of mind. Therefore, if something, and I really believe that disclosing this in the auditor's report is out of context. Put it in the proxy where, if we want to, make it voluntary. I'll bet you if it do best practices, there will be a lot of registrants that will follow suit. But it could be couched within the auditor's or the audit committee's report where we, in effect, challenge performance and reappointment. However, if that doesn't fly, I have another suggestion. 10 years ago, we used to file with the PCAOB all of our registrant information. I don't know if that's still being done, but assume it is. Why don't we just have the firms put in there how long they, in effect, have been a client? And that has access, it used to be public information, maybe it isn't anymore, but the public could, any investor that's interested could access that public information in a few seconds. So anyway, just a thought.
Do you have a reaction to the comment that Jeff made that to the extent investors think that this is important, this is a proposal that would get this out to investors potentially in the near term, whereas if your argument is maybe it belongs more in the proxy, there's no action or taking place right now or no proposals on the plate to put that information in the proxy other than voluntary. And there are some companies that are voluntarily disclosing that, but there's no action underway, as far as I know, to put it required in the proxy.
Well, I don't know of any action either. I do know that some registrants already put it in the proxy. And, working with NACD and others, we could get this going if that's so important to investors. But again, I'll go back to what I said before. For audit committees to opine on independence and performance, we do represent shareholders. And therefore, we've already concluded on that issue. However, if we want to have it in the sunshine, put it in these reports, and the firms file them annually, I believe. They still do, I hope.
They do. That's a Form 2 you're referring to, and that is available. And of course, an investor would have to do some searching to find not only the firm, but then the issuer and so on and so forth. But it's an option that I'm glad you pointed that possibility out.
Okay, Jerry DeSampere.
Thank you. I guess this is going to feel like piling on, but I think my perception of it, while consistent with the views, for example, that Bob just expressed and others, it has a twist to it. I chair one audit committee. I'm on another audit committee. In every one of the audit committee meetings, we take pains to confirm with the auditors that they understand they report to us, the audit committee. They don't report to management. We make that very clear. We make very clear that they have access. But the other thing that's very clear is that the responsibility for taking, and I thought the comment by Professor Cox was very interesting, too short, too long. The audit committee is where the buck stops in deciding whether it's too short or too long or what the other factors are. It is not the auditor. I mean, with all due respect, the auditor can have their views of it, but who actually decides whether you're going to recommend the appointment of that auditor for another year, as Bob says, 1 year at a time, it falls to the audit committee. So I hear the point about the issue about timing, that if you put it into the auditor's report, you're going to get something sooner. But it absolutely is out of context because it doesn't include the judgment of the people who are actually making the decision whether the independence is adequate for reappointment or not. That is the audit committee. So I guess I would urge, we've got Brian sitting here, we could all go beat up on Brian to try to get something moving at the SEC or to get the NACD or others. I think that what I'm focused on here is what's right and not what's expedient. I can understand why investors find this information meaningful. I completely get that. I completely also understand and sympathize with the view of the PCAOB to try to do something about that. I just think we've got the ball in the wrong place. I think to have an auditor say they think they're independent is fine, but I think it misses the fact. The second thing that I wanted to express, and it has to do with this auditor independence when I read the proposal, and it goes to a little bit the concern I had yesterday. And you can't get away from your roots, having been CFO of an insurance company that does auditor liability insurance. The fact is here, what will happen, and then if you sit on the audit committee and the lawyers come in and they say, okay, we've got these new rules, what will happen, I'm afraid, and this is the thing I would urge that, and I don't know how you deal with this, because I understand what you're trying to get on the CAM, I understand what you're trying to get on auditor independence, but the pressure toward boilerplate is going to be so strong. And I mean, can you imagine that this new thing comes out, we've got the new CAM, we've got this, and then there ends up being a problem. It's like a roadmap to litigation. So what's going to happen, I predict, is that it'll go overboard. There actually is no incentive for anybody to do anything other than to throw the kitchen sink in and call it material. So unfortunately, you should never make a suggestion. On the first instance, my suggestion is put it in the proxy. On this one, unfortunately, I don't have any helpful guidance, except that I could just see this thing blowing out the auditor's report significantly into a big document, which will be almost unfathomable for the average investor to be able to understand.
That's a risk that you certainly were concerned about. We're concerned about boilerplate. So the things you brought up are good points that could risk the value that we're trying to bring. So we'll carefully think about those issues. Brian's card promptly went up when you talked about the SEC. So we'll give the floor to Brian Croto.
Thanks, Marty, and good morning. And I guess first I just wanted to say I don't feel beat up upon it at all. I think it's really important that we all hear these comments, and but again, my disclaimer from yesterday still applies as well. But certainly geography can be extremely important, and we do appreciate the comments in that regard, and particularly when we're talking about matters that may have to do with whether you're evaluating the engagement of the auditor versus the report and the completion of the audit. We certainly can appreciate, or I can appreciate, the differences between the two, and so I don't think people should feel restrained in offering whatever feedback they think is appropriate about either the nature of a disclosure or the appropriateness of the location. And certainly me and my staff are here, and others are listening to take good notes on that. So appreciate the feedback.
Okay, thank you. Oh, sorry. A number of cards up, and then like to try to get to other information. And but next on my list is Walt Kahn.
This may also feel like piling on at this point, but I'll take Brian's invitation. In the interest of transparency, I fully support the disclosure of auditor tenure in a place that's easy for investors to find. I would argue, though, that including it in the auditor's report, just to echo some of the other comments that have been made, implies a correlation between tenure, a sweet spot for tenure from shortly after first year, second year, whatever that may be, to whatever a long tenure is, a sweet spot between that and audit quality that I don't think is known today. And therefore, I agree with the comments that have been made that it seems out of context to be in the auditor's report, and seems like to me the best place would be in the proxy or the Form 2. Thanks.
Thank you. Bill Platt.
Thank you. The point's been made by
several people that the consideration of tenure really is a question of reappointment of the auditor and the audit committee's responsibility and the audit committee's focus. And many people have observed that maybe it's better placed in a proxy which discusses the audit committee's decision to reappoint the auditor. I would actually agree with that. And then others have said then that, well, but because the SEC doesn't have a project currently, therefore it'll take longer to get through proxy than possibly what the PCAOB can do through mandating through an auditor's report. You know, it kind of reminds me of the only tool we have is a hammer. We're going to think that everything's a nail. And I wonder, though, whether or not there might be a way to accomplish it through saying that if it has not already been disclosed in a proxy, then the auditor will include tenure in the report. But if the company and the audit committee has included auditor tenure in the proxy, then the auditor's report would be silent to that fact. So it might be a way for the PCAOB to take action, which sort of goes along the way of encouraging proxy disclosure, and many companies then will probably jump on that, and therefore one place or the other you would end up finding the disclosure of tenure information. So just a thought in terms of saying, you know, can you use the hammer of the PCAOB to get disclosure either in proxies or in the report itself?
So just, Bill, to make sure I'm thinking about it the same way as you're suggesting it. So you're suggesting, because generally the proxy is filed after, but you're talking the proxy that was filed before.
The proxy that was filed before.
For the appointment of that year.
Yeah, it would be a little different than now the incorporation by reference of compensation information, which is going to be in the next proxy, because you wouldn't necessarily know what was going to be in the next proxy. But if it was in connection with the appointment for that year had been disclosed, then it wouldn't need to be repeated in the auditor's report.
Okay, thank you. Dan Montgomery.
Thank you, Jennifer. And just a quick comment on independence to compare and contrast a bit with the IAASB proposal, because I know that many in the room will be reviewing and commenting on both. Like the PCAOB, the global stakeholders of the IAASB felt there would be value in having a statement about independence in the auditor's report. However, the IAASB stakeholders, in particular global securities regulators, felt that there should be, along the point that Galen made earlier, an affirmative statement of independence. And so the IAASB's proposal is to specifically indicate that we are independent of the company within the meaning of the relevant ethical requirements or applicable law or regulation, and have fulfilled our other responsibilities under those ethical requirements. Also would be required to specifically identify the relevant ethical requirements. And the IAASB in formulating that language also considered the notion of breaches, and maybe this is something that works in the international arena, because there's a recent revision to the International Ethics Code that suggests that if there are any breaches of independence requirements, the auditor is required to communicate those with those charged with governance. And if the auditor believes that appropriate action can be taken and those charged with governance agree, then the auditor is able to affirm independence and issue an independent auditor's report. So the affirmative statement about independence, at least in the IAASB view, would work in that regard.
Thank you, Dan. Roman Wheel.
I'm not necessarily been paying attention, but I'm confused about the auditor tenure and the disclosure that we have in mind here. In the audit committees where I serve, we got an audit partner, we got an audit partner in waiting. The guy's going to be the next audit partner. We've got the confirming partner. We've got the partner who resolves conflicts if something comes up. He's sort of in the background. And we've got the seniors and managers. And in our audit committee reports, we get a table with every one of these people, who they are, how long they've been serving, and when the audit companies, audit firms' rules will require that person to go off. Sometimes the audit companies' rules are more stringent than the SEC rules, the regulators' rule, but they'll tell us how long we've been there, when it has to go, and what the plan is for taking over. Now, I can't tell from any of this discussion, when we're talking about auditor tenure, we're talking about one person, or we're talking about the whole team. And if it's the whole team, I think that's fine, and we get it already. I just don't see what's a big deal.
Tenure would be the firm relationship, so there would be natural rotation of the partner, for example. But to Marty's example he used earlier, the firm may have been auditing a company for 100 years. There's rotation of the individual partners every 5 years, but the question is, some perceive that the 100-year relationship, even though there is the individual rotation, but may have added pressure for
So
those
that word
partners.
auditor means the firm,
Auditor
not
means
the
the
person.
firm,
Not
yeah.
the person.
Right, firm.
Okay, I wasn't the firm.
Okay, I don't see any further cards up, so I'm going to move on to other information, and thank you for your comments on both of those points. I think it was very valuable. Some good questions and suggestions came out of that. For other information, included in the PCAOB's proposal, as Jessica described, there was a proposed standard regarding the auditor's responsibilities for other information regarding the annual report that's filed with the SEC. So that would be the 1934 Act filings, generally, the 10K. So interested in your views on the usefulness of including a statement in the auditor's report about the auditor's responsibilities for other information. The proposed language in the report would state that the auditor has read and evaluated the other information. The auditor's responsibilities include looking for both material inconsistencies with the audited financial statements. So if looking at amounts and disclosures in the audited financial statements, if revenue is stated at $100 million, is it $1 billion in the 10K? That would be a material inconsistency. So they're looking for consistency with the financial statements. And the auditor also would have a responsibility to look for material misstatement of fact. They have both these responsibilities today, but a material misstatement of fact could be the auditor knows through their audit that the company's a manufacturer of widgets. They're not the leading manufacturer, say they're number 3, but in the 10K they disclose they're the leading manufacturer of widgets. The auditor may believe that would be market-moving information if the public believed that they were the leading manufacturer, but based on the auditor's audit, obtaining understanding of the company, they know that's incorrect. So under our proposed standard, the auditor would have a responsibility to discuss that with the audit committee to have that be removed, clarified. And the proposed standard also includes procedures to evaluate the other information. Today, the auditor's procedures are read and consider. That's it. It's whatever the auditor does in connection with consideration. We have read and evaluate, and evaluation means for different types of procedures, such as comparing the amounts with the financial statements for consistency, looking at the disclosures, taking into consideration the other information the auditor knows, is there any material misstatements of fact, and looking at calculations that are presented in the other information. So I'll just open that up generally for views on other information, and you can feel free to touch on any or all of those points. Let's see, who's my, Ian Dingwall.
Thank you. As I read this report on other information, it presumes the other information is in fact presented. In other words, it's a report on that which is presented. It is not necessarily a report on things that might be required but are not presented. In other words, we do require in 11K filings or plan filings that a lot of other information be presented. The problem usually is it's not presented, it's not there. So I would think that this report on other information could be more valuable if it talked about the completeness of the information or make some reference to the fact that none of the required information has been omitted, something along those lines. Just to say what is presented is fairly stated in relation to the financial statements as taken as a whole is fine, but it would be, I would think, more valuable if it suggested that the information that is required to be there is in fact there. So opining that nothing's been omitted, I think would add to the value of this report?
So let me just comment on that, Ian, just to clarify a couple of things. So the other information, of course, we're talking about is in connection with the 34 Act filing. And what has to be there is in accordance with the SEC rules in connection with that particular 34 Act filing for either a corporation or a mutual fund or whatever it might be in that 34 Act filing. We did ask in the concept release on auditor reporting, should auditors have some further responsibility to examine the other information? And generally there was not support for that. To the extent there was support, I think there was support for the auditor's continuing responsibility to read other information and consider whether it has any material inconsistencies with the audited financial statements or material misstatement of fact. So there is not a requirement in existing standards, and we're not proposing one for the auditor to extend his or her responsibilities to ensure that the company has fully complied with all the various aspects of the SEC rules as to what has to be in MD&A, what has to be in risk factors, what has to be in the various aspects of the 34 Act filing. That would be a separate engagement. Legal interpretations would be involved in terms of what would have to be included in that information. And so that is not the extent of our proposal at this point. We've heard your view that you think that would be valuable for the auditor to do that. We haven't proposed that, and we really hadn't heard a lot of support for that, but I'll be interested to see if others do that. The comment that something's presented fairly presented in all material respects went to something I discussed yesterday on supplemental information that's related to the financial statements that's required by SEC rules to be part of the financials, but it's supplemental. With respect to the other information we're talking about here, like MD&A and risk factors, there's no opinion being expressed on that information. It's a matter of we've read and evaluated it, and we're not aware of any material inconsistencies or material misstatements of fact. Now, that's some type of assurance, but it's not an expression of an opinion. I don't know, hopefully that clarified if anybody had any confusion as to what the requirements were.
Thank you, Marty. Denny Beresford.
I think this part of the proposal could be one of the more useful additions to the auditor's report. And in the concept release, I think a lot of other people supported it with the sort of implicit understanding that at the time, the idea was simply to have the auditor report explicitly on what was already being done. But the proposal, and looking at one of the earlier slides, indicates that this would enhance the auditor's responsibility with respect to other information, and these are the key words, by adding procedures for the auditor to perform in evaluating the other information based on relevant audit evidence obtained and conclusions reached during the audit. Adding procedures, I guess, would be the key words. And in looking at the releases that came out shortly after the proposal by at least two of the major firms, and I suspect the others would agree at this point, they characterize this as substantial additional work that would have to be performed. At this point, it isn't clear what that exactly means, but it sounds like a very major undertaking that the firms see. Reading the document, it's not clear exactly what the PCAOB has in mind, and it's not clear, of course, to me what the firms have in mind that they would have to do. One obvious concern is that without a lot more specificity, this could turn into another PCAOB auditing standard number 2 versus 5 kind of situation where something is put out along the lines of what you have right now. The firms think, again, lots and lots and lots and lots of additional work, and then we find out that's not really what was necessary, but in the meantime we've added, pick a percent, 10%, 20% or whatever to our audit fees and so forth for minimal additional benefit, if any, to the users. Again, I think going back to my beginning point, if we were simply asking the auditors to report on what they were already doing, in other words, that they had, as part of existing standards, reviewed the other information and in connection with the procedures that were already part of the audit, and found it not to be inconsistent, and simply stated that with appropriate caveats in the report and so forth, and not putting subheadings in and other information that would lead the users to believe that this was subject to a lot of additional auditing and so forth, I think that could be a major step forward. I guess my major concern again is that would it really be worth it to add a lot of additional procedures to create something that would not be fully audited in any event? I guess my major suggestion here would be that I think this is something that would really, I would urge you to be very careful, and I'm not sure exactly how you do it, but I think you need to do some field testing. And I don't know how you can field test something in advance, but I urge, Marty, that you work with the accounting firms and get an understanding of what do they mean, what do they have in mind in terms of all these additional procedures that would have to be performed, and compare that to what you believe are the added procedures that would be necessary to meet the requirements of the proposed standard, and try to have a meeting of the minds in advance, as opposed to putting out a standard that would then be, in effect, non-operational or be subject to a lot of ambiguity, again, like the unfortunate situation we had before. Given the existing situation, given the uncertainty about what's going to be performed, I don't believe that it's supportable in its present form, but if it can be, you might say, rolled back to just reporting on, I think it's AU 550 approach, then I think that would be a very good step forward.
I just want to react to a couple points you made, and kind of your suggestion at the end, your recommendation that we just stay with the standard we have. Our challenge in using the standard we have today and having the auditors report on that is the auditor's responsibility is read and consider. And there are no procedures about what does consider mean. So one auditor may do all these procedures and more, and we heard a lot in our outreach, because we did ask, that was one of the alternatives in the release, if the auditor should perform additional assurance. We received a lot of feedback that auditors do a lot today in connection with the consideration, but what's not clear to users is what is meant by consideration. One auditor could do a lot, another may read and not do much with it. So we're looking for consistency in how auditors are reviewing that information. We do consider it important information, that there's no material inconsistencies, material misstatements of facts, because the auditor's report's included in it, so they're associated with that document. The evaluation, the procedures in there, you compared it, a significant amount of work. Interested in reaction from the firms, our experience in developing the standard. We thought it was reasonable procedures. Again, it was consistent with outreach that we had conducted, that auditors are generally performing a lot of work, a lot of these types of procedures, checking consistency of amounts, checking to make sure that disclosures, what's in the financial statements, is not inconsistent with how it's being presented. So, interested in other views on that, but, just wanted to react to some of your points. And Marty, you want to add on?
Well, I don't want to add on it, but I want to concur with Denny that we don't want to create an AS2 type environment. So, and that's the reason why we put out a proposal and have SAG discussions around it, and hopefully we'll get comment letters that will, if there are concerns around the nature of this, that it's not understandable, or it's ambiguous, or there's too many procedures, we'll get those comments and certainly react to that. There's at least some of us who have audited large companies at the PCAOB, who, when we looked at this, said this is basically what we thought was pretty much existing practice, in major corporations at least, that basically the auditors felt this was part of what they did to read and consider, and certainly the audit committees in a lot of companies said, we want you to read this information and make sure it's consistent with the financials, and if there's anything material misstatements of facts, certainly bring those to our attention. So our view is that a lot of this, and these 4 procedures, so there aren't extensive amount, there's 4 procedures, we felt was pretty much maybe best practice that was already happening today in a lot of corporations. Although we thought there was probably varying practice among the 10,000 audits in the country. But your points are all well made, and we look for comment if it is creating confusion, ambiguity, or more work than's necessary. So we'll hear that from firms or others. Thanks, Denny.
Brian Croto?
Thanks very much, and it relates to these points, I think. And Denny mentioned these words, and I hate to get overly technical, but I just want to be sure that we're all thinking of an aspect of this that I think is embedded in the comments that were just made. But paragraph 4 contains the words that Denny was reading from a performance perspective that get at the auditor should read the other information and, based on relevant audit evidence obtained and conclusions reached during the audit, perform certain procedures. Paragraph 13C, which has the report, contains those same words. And it occurs to me that users of the report may not necessarily know what all of the evidence was that the auditor obtained. And so there's a limiting principle here relative to the auditor's work that has to do with what evidence the auditor gained in conducting their audit work. They're not expected per the standard, although they may for other reasons, but not for the standard, to go further and obtain more evidence in conducting this aspect of the work. So I think there's a limiting principle built in. Whether that's the appropriate limiting principle might be a question for people to comment on, and then how users will interpret the report, given that they won't know necessarily as a user what evidence the auditor obtained, I think is an interesting question that I'd certainly be interested in feedback on either today or through the comment process. But I thought I would just highlight that because I think that is an important element of what's being described here relative to the limitations and what stops this from being a full audit. Another element of what stops this from being a full audit or something that is more like AS2 if people think of it that way.
That's a good point, Brian. And we intentionally, of course, put that limiting factor in that it is the auditor performs these procedures, read and evaluate in the context of information based on relevant audit evidence obtained during the audit. And the point is that the auditor is not now supposed to, not required by the standard, to perform additional procedures to learn something about whether or not some product in R&D is going to be launched next year or not, if that's the statement being made in the other information, if that wasn't part of what the auditor obtained as part of their evidence. And again, the procedures then are tied to, the 4 procedures are tied to what the auditor learned as part of the audit, and then comparing that to what's in the other information. But I fully accept your point, Denny, that we want to make sure that it's clearly understood. And Brian's point goes to another issue, though, that there could be an expectation gap with this statement in here that we've read this other information and evaluated it, et cetera, that someone might think they did perform other procedures, even though it says in the report, we did not audit this other information, did not express opinion on it, and it was based upon what we learned during our audit. But it has that expectation gap risk potentially. So we wanted to get comments, on all of that.
Thank you. Richard Breeden.
Thank you. I think the objectives here are understandable and worthwhile, and certainly the notion as a member of an audit committee that the auditor, in considering their work, has developed a conclusion that there is a material misstatement of fact. It doesn't seem radical that they should communicate that. But the way this is drafted, material inconsistency and material misstatement of fact, to me that sounds awfully much like a violation of Rule 10b-5. That is fraud. And so asking the auditor to report on a formulation that sounds like a legal conclusion of fraud, and if it's material and it's a misstatement of fact, it's unlikely to be accidental. There's almost certainly going to be an element of cyanar in there. Anyway, to me, I think you need to work carefully to make sure we are not creating something that becomes a rival legal review for the issues of fraud. And I'm worried that this would trigger something that it could either be meaningless because the standard is such that if you haven't reached a conclusion that all the elements of a material misstatement are there, you wouldn't report it. And yet the obligation to make that statement, if it's formulated in a way that is essentially a judgment of fraud, if you want to say that auditors should report on any signs of potential fraud they've seen, that's one thing. But this is a legal conclusion that you may want to work on the formulation.
Well, you raise a good point. In the standard, we do point the auditor to our fraud standard when they identify material inconsistencies, material misstatements of fact. I think we recognize there could be a difference between the audited financial statements and the 10K, could be just an error. But we do point the auditor to consider the nature, discuss it with management, go back to the fraud standards to consider if it's something more than that. The current standard, under our current framework, the auditor reporting standard would allow the auditor to issue an unqualified report, even if there's a material misstatement of fact. They could include a paragraph and say, we believe the audited financial statements are okay, but we have identified this material misstatement of fact. We are asking questions about the auditor's responsibility when something's identified and not corrected in their continued association. Kind of along, I think, those same lines. Did you look like you were going to react to that?
Just the further observation that auditors are not experts in general matters of fact. And so when you go beyond the financial statements and into the realm of any misstatement of fact without qualification, that really can, and without very carefully delineating, as Denny and others have said, what you have in mind, I think it would not be helpful to investors if you moved down the road toward kind of competing 10Ks. And the whole world of facts about a company's business that may be included in its reports get far afield from the financial information that the auditors are expert in reviewing. So that also is a slight concern of where this evolves to, and making sure it's quite clear at the outset, because that's a path that might lead other directions.
Richard, thank you. Those are all good points, and we really have to consider those, especially the auditors are not in a position to reach a conclusion necessarily about violations of 10b-5. And I just will point out, however, that under existing standard AU 550, which is the read and consider other information, so there is an existing standard today which requires the auditor to read and consider the other information to see if there's a material inconsistency with the audited financial statements. And it does go on to say, if while reading that other information, the auditor becomes aware of a material misstatement of fact, the auditor should discuss that with the audit committee and consider other actions. So there is existing auditing literature already that has this, so we've built on that. So, but nevertheless, even though we're building on that, we'll take into account the concerns and considerations that you've expressed.
You might be better off having something where if the auditor is aware of an apparent inconsistency, they should discuss that, as opposed to keying it off a legal conclusion. And if the auditor is worried that what they have read is inconsistent with what they have seen, that's worthy of a discussion with the audit committee, and they shouldn't sit back and be having their own lawyers trying to evaluate, has this crossed the line into an actual material misstatement of fact.
Thanks.
Okay, Jerry DeSampere.
Thank you. I seem to be in the piling on mode today, but I hope from a little different perspective than the perspective that's been expressed, even though it supports that. From the perspective of a CFO of a New York Stock Exchange company, with auditors who I couldn't tell you. Clearly from their procedures, they were required to take a look at the other information, but we would never have issued it without them taking a look at it. So I'm not really sure what the chicken and the egg was there. But I watched the way in which that procedure was done, and it goes to what Dennis said. There's a great deal of difference between making an affirmative statement of this kind and simply following the procedures. Again, one of those companies that I was a CFO of happened to be one who wrote a lot of auditor liability insurance. And I can tell you that will cause the kind of reaction that Dennis was concerned about, where to be able to make that kind of a positive assessment, to go to the 10b-5 or the SAB 99 issue, you're asking the auditor to take an additional step. So I would just also argue the caution. But what I want to also make a second point that I think is really important is that we heard in the presentation yesterday about the volatility of earnings based on volatility of share prices based on release of earnings. From the experience, at least in the companies I've been CFO of, and since I was CFO, I was pretty interested in what the stock price did relative to the release of earnings. That volatility is almost all related to the press release. What happens when the K or the Q comes out is very little additional movement. And so the whole issue at front, we also, by the way, had the auditors review the press release to make sure that there was no material inconsistency or misstatement of fact, just to make sure that we were okay. But there's a lot of non-GAAP measures. The things that drive the market, which is one of the things I thought was missing in yesterday's presentation, the things that drive the market, with all due respect to the SEC and the design of all of the reports, isn't actually materially driven. It is at least equally driven by the non-GAAP information in most cases as it is by the GAAP information. So I just want to say, well, this is the concern about the risk you're creating by forcing this affirmative representation to what Mr. Breeden said is a big issue, and I'm not sure it's got the elephant in the room, because the thing that really is creating the biggest movement of share prices for the investors that are concerned about this information, actually it doesn't come out of the MD&A. What I found astounding in meetings with investors is that the questions almost always they actually come before we ever issued the K or the Q. They came from the press release. And so I'd just like to caution to keep our eye on the ball here, that we're acting as if this other information is really the stuff that's driving investors, and I guess maybe everybody here, all the investors are going to come, oh, well, we look at all that stuff. I can say from my side, in talking with all my investors, that's not where the questions came from. So just in terms of priority, this will, I'm sure, involve additional scope and expense, and I'm not sure about the cost and the return.
Those comments we've heard from others, and I'll look to the left of the room over here to Mike. We've often heard about what really drives the stock price, and what investors are really concerned about is probably in much earlier releases than the 10K. And so we've heard certainly that comment before. To some extent, we're limited in terms of the auditor's responsibility that they have to audit financial statements and report on financial statements and what's associated with the financial statements, we can, their responsibilities can go to that too. And at least right now, under our authority, I don't believe, speaking for myself only, that we could require an auditor to perform procedures on that press release. But we've heard that from Mike and from others, that would be very valuable if auditors were required to do that. But at least speaking for myself, and only for myself, I don't think we could require auditors to do that under existing authority that we have. But one thing I will add, many, maybe not all, but much of the information that gets in that press release that drives the market at that time and the non-GAAP measures are also in that 10K and are discussed in that 10K. It's usually the same type of information around a non-GAAP measure or the performance that was previously discussed in a release is in the business section of the 10K. The auditor, management knowing that the auditor is going to read and evaluate that 10K, which includes probably those same non-GAAP measures, which the auditor would have to, under these standards, see how they're reconciled to the financial statements to be not misleading and create a material inconsistency with the financial statements, I think has a deterring effect on management's behavior when they come out with that release, knowing that the auditor will be performing procedures on that information later on. So I fully acknowledge what drives it, but knowing that that same information is likely to be in the 10K to be read and evaluated at a later date, I think has a deterring effect in addition. So interested in your comments on that. I wish we could have the auditors do more up front. And I know you want to comment even further. You're anxious to say something here.
I am. Because of the legal environment, at least in our case, we didn't release the press release until we had virtually a complete draft of the 10K and the MD&A done. Because you could not possibly have a situation occur where you, well, at least I don't think a responsible person could, put out a press release where a few weeks later you're going to put out a 10K. You may have that you virtually have to be almost at the point where the auditors are pens down by the time you issue the press release, where you're taking huge liability. So, and actually, I was surprised Brian's card didn't go up, because the truth is, what happens if you don't put a reconciliation of the non-GAAP measures in the back of that press release or the supplemental information that you put out, which reconciles to the audited information, the next call comes from the SEC. I mean, I've had the opportunity to have that conversation with them. So, and rightly, that's not a criticism. That's as it should be. But there is a reconciliation, and the audit's not done. So people don't put out press releases hoping that they get within the range of the 10K. Most companies have this stuff all come together at the same time.
And thanks for that additional color and valuable input. Walt Kahn is next.
Yeah, in my firm, we're still developing our views on parts of this standard, and particularly our comfort with the words in the report. But let me just circle back to Denny's question on the procedures that are in here. I think in general, in my experience, these procedures are consistent with what we do today. However, there are a couple of words or phrases that give us pause, and we're formulating our questions or recommendations on those. But we want to be sure there is clarity about whether the scope of our work should expand beyond what it is today, and whether our responsibility should expand. One of the changes that gives us pause is the change from consider to evaluate, because if evaluate means do these procedures that are listed, period, then maybe that's okay. If evaluate means do these procedures and whatever else you need to do to conclude that you have performed an evaluation, then that probably lacks some specificity that is needed. The other change that gives us pause is that the reference to consistency with the financial statements in the proposal now adds consistency with the relevant audit evidence. And that seems to be a subtle expansion beyond where we are today.
Just, Walt, to respond to that, you asked about what does evaluate mean. The way it's phrased in the standard, we have evaluation based on the procedures in paragraph 4. So, I don't know if you, and continuing your thinking on that, if you're just concerned about how that may be perceived in the report, but at least the way it's proposed in the standard, it's based on those 4 procedures in paragraph 4.
Yeah, and we realize that and are just struggling with that choice of words, whether it will be clear to all stakeholders that evaluate means just perform these procedures. Because we think of evaluate as not being limited to specific procedures, but going beyond that.
Well, good points, and we'll think of that as we consider where to go with this. But it was interesting to hear your comment that you think largely these are the nature of the things that you do today, but with a careful looking at each of the words to make sure that they are the same as what you do today.
Thank you. Damon Silvers?
I just wanted to comment on the issue of whether or not material inconsistency and material misstatement of fact are necessarily a legal conclusion. I think that the issue that's been raised is an important one to get right, but that without a statement about scienter here, it's not a legal conclusion, and at least with respect to 10b-5. I can't see how you could even. I can't see if an auditor were aware of a material misstatement of fact under the current reporting rules, that an auditor could sign the letter certifying the financial statement. So it's not clear to me that this even, at least as stated on this slide, that it necessarily even represents an expansion of the auditor's current duties. And as long as you don't add a scienter component to it, I don't think it represents a legal conclusion.
Statement. Wally Cooney?
Most of the concerns that I had have been covered one way or the other, so I'll just comment that I share the concerns about the expectation gap. While it's helpful that the opinion drafted clearly says that they did not audit this other information, I think that's important. The word evaluate, even in the context of specific procedures, I think could really cause a problem with respect to expectation gap. And just in practice, now that the auditors will be commenting, at least providing negative assurance on the other information, I think sometimes that has the practical effect of just taking on a life of its own, including getting into non-financial information and a lot of work, a lot of discussion, a lot of higher and more experienced people spending significant time on going through all that information, and I think there could be a significant cost effect. The only other concern is that to the extent that MD&A is supposed to be through the eyes of management and really is supposed to be management's report, I have some concern that companies may want to limit disclosure, maybe water down some of the commentary that they might have otherwise felt was more transparent and comfortable saying, but not have it subjected to the scrutiny of a long, drawn-out review process and discussion.
Thank you. Professor Cox?
I think it'd be helpful if you could separate these two issues out. into two things. One is the process, exactly what are the documents that are to be looked at and what the procedures are to be by the outside auditor, what they're supposed to look at, in which they're going to formulate some sort of an opinion. And then the other question, I would say, separate from that, is how and to whom you communicate that. Richard Breeden made the observation, and never underestimate the power of a modifier, appropriate. And I think that that's something worth thinking about. But the other idea I'd put out there, to take also some of the steam out of the process and some of the angst out of the process, is to work this a little bit through the existing legal framework and think that maybe investors are not the group that on a big full-blown evaluation or reporting on the evaluation to all the investor community is not where you want to go. You would say, add to your standard that conversations have been had, that your duties are to see if there's any apparent inconsistencies, and part of your obligation is to communicate those to the audit committee, in which case I would think that that then triggers the existing format for what happens to auditors in certain situations under 10 capital A of the Exchange Act. And that could be a way of at least making this initial step. I'm not sure where we're going to be 10 years from now in terms of this process, but maybe this would be a somewhat more palatable process to going through. But I do think it is going to be useful to you to unpack, first of all, what you want the auditors to do from the question about how that then gets communicated and to whom.
Thank you. We've talked, just reflecting on the comments so far on this subject, talked a lot about the procedures, what does read and evaluate mean, the work effort. I haven't heard that much, though, on the point regarding usefulness of reporting. In our outreach, we had heard in one of the alternatives presented in the concept release on whether or not the auditor should provide additional assurance, was not to provide additional assurance, really just describe the responsibilities that the auditor does with respect to the annual report. So that was our intent. It initiated from a reporting element, thinking that might be useful. So I'm interested in feedback on that. We did feel that the current version of the report, just the read and consider with no procedures, wasn't robust enough to support a statement in the auditor's report. So we felt we needed to make some enhancement, have some minimum set of procedures regarding what the auditor does, their procedures over the other information. But, interested very much in is having the auditor report on whether you call, it's consideration, evaluation, is that used, and the auditor's findings, is that useful to investors? So hopefully, and some of the, if any other comments, or if anyone that has their comment cards up now has any reaction, interested in thoughts on that. Next is Galen Hansen.
Jennifer, I absolutely think that it would be helpful to clarify this aspect of what auditors do, and I agree with what's been said. A lot is done now, and I think that what you've done here is responsive in large part to addressing that issue. I'll try to bring out just a couple of other things really quickly, though. Who does this? And it's not the firm, it's people within the firm, and I think for it to be meaningful, it needs to be senior individuals on the engagement team. And all too often I've seen this delegated to lower level staff people, and that tends to be a focus on the numerical aspects as opposed to the qualitative, the nuance and the spin and the tone. You read the financial statements and they have one tone, and you read the forepart of a 10K and it's almost a completely, it seems like it's written from a completely different perspective. And particularly when it comes to minimization and exaggeration and the wording in which you couch certain things, I think does impact the way investors might approach things and consider the company. To your example, making widgets and characterizing yourself as a leading manufacturer of the widgets when you know you're third. Well, a lot of times what I see is someone saying, we're a leading manufacturer of the widgets, and you know perfectly well that's not the case. it's a misstatement, but it's not numerical. And for a lower-level staff person to be able to pick up on that, I think is asking a lot of them. So I think the who does this and the tone and the spin and focusing on the qualitative is just as important as the numerical.
Thanks, Galen. Steve Buller?
Thank you. First of all, just a couple clarifying comments. One is, I thought there was the inference earlier that a material misstatement may be fraud, and certainly there are conditions where you may have errors or typographical issues that, of course, occur, and as long as there is not intent or knowledge of the misstatement, I don't think that as a non-attorney that would be something I would classify as fraud. And secondly is with respect to just the timing of press releases and 10Ks, there are some companies that do produce a 10K and a press release concurrently, but quite often it's because they have material information that they need. Quite often it's codependent upon a third party, and they can't obtain that in time to provide an earlier press release. But most companies do a press release 2 to 3 weeks after a quarter end or period end, and so that does precede the 10K in most situations. But they do, of course, make sure the information that is in the press release is, in fact, accurate, because most of it does, as you said, Marty, appear in a 10K. So the main question is we do support clarifying the responsibility for other information. I think it's a good idea. I think generally, I think I'm concerned it could be an expansion of scope, especially if the other information includes documents that are incorporated by reference. I know when I go through our 10K and through others, incorporated by reference documents often are 2 or 3 pages long of listings. And our concern, of course, is that it would take auditors just time to read that listing, let alone to read the documents that are included in there, just to see if there is information that may in fact be relevant to the audit. Then lastly is, I think that as part of the auditor performing their work, even though I know they're supposed to consider and evaluate information that's based upon evidence that's already been obtained, if I were an auditor and I saw, for example, information that had a number of factors, one of which was information that was based upon audit information that I had obtained to do my core financial statements, but there was other information I had not obtained or did not have, I'd make sure my audit planning included getting that information as part of my audit. So it may, in fact, be that there would be an expansion of scope just to CYA in part to make sure that where there is information presented with information that would not otherwise normally be obtained as part of an audit, that it now becomes part of the audit planning process and therefore is obtained as part of the audit. So again, it's probably just the discussion of the expansion of scope. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Steve. Elizabeth Mooney?
Okay, thanks. I think it would be great if the earnings release and the 10Qs would come out at the same time. I mean, that would be fantastic, and some companies do that. Obviously, investors do respond, as Marty, just to echo your comments, I mean, they do respond to the most recent information, whatever that is, and the earnings release is significant. But my experience, and I have the great fortune of working with, best and brightest, I believe, investors, analysts, and for the long term, fundamental research is all we do, and they do read the 10Qs extensively and the 10Ks. So I think in terms of the other information, I said this earlier, but the goal, and I mean, we're getting a little sidetracked with a lot of this. The goal is if the auditors are aware in their work of material misstatements, otherwise, like Galen mentioned, that there is some responsibility to fix it. I mean, I think that's the end goal, and not just be silent. And I think that's the spirit of the project, and I would encourage you not to lose sight of that. So.
Thank you. Rick Murray.
Jennifer, a question and a brief explanation of why I ask. The question is it correct to understand that if the additional information that's at issue is itself not material, then it is impossible for that information to produce a material inconsistency or a material misstatement? And the reason for the question has to do with the rapidly emerging movement now called integrated reporting, which really has two prongs, one of which is the view of many that there should be more attention to sustainability-related information included in financial reporting as a voluntary, non-material election by reporting entities. And the second prong, best illustrated by the work of the Sustainability Accounting Standards Board, suggests that all sustainability-related information should in fact be recognized as material. And it's that duality of position at the moment and what will be, I think, a very rapid evolution to sustainability reporting issues arising in the next few years that I direct the question, because those issues would be a great deal easier to deal with if there were 2 points of clarity. That is the answer to one is the answer to my question, and the other is what standard of materiality will be applied in making the determination of what falls within the scope.
I don't think I have an answer to your first question, whether or not one could conclude that if there's if the information by itself is not material, could you have a material misstatement or material inconsistency? There's requirements of what has to be included in a 10K under the Securities Act, and I don't think we've thought through whether that information or some of that is by definition not material, and therefore it wouldn't be subject to a consideration of a material inconsistency or material misstatement of fact, or whether a company decided to put in other sustainability information and how that might fit into this equation. I think you raised some things for us to think about with respect to that, but I don't think we've really explored that thought as part of this proposal. So I'll just say we'll take your comment and note it and give it some thought.
Okay, Wayne Collins.
Yeah, thank you. With respect to the reporting and the relationship of that to the limited nature of the procedures, and the procedures are more than read and consider, and probably is similar to what's done currently in practice. But the conclusion is the negative assurance that was mentioned before is something that you see in a review engagement, and these are not review procedures. I think they're probably something less than review procedures. And I wonder if a way around that would be to specify that these are limited procedures, describe what the auditor's responsibility is to see that the information is revised, and if it's not, to refer to it in his or her report. And the absence of any such revision would be implicitly that the auditor did not have an issue with it, that nothing, the auditor did not become aware of anything. Just an approach to take care of the very limited nature of the procedures and the ultimate reporting on it.
We understand that point and understand the careful line between the nature of the type of assurance being expressed and whether or not the procedures are the right procedures in connection with that type of assurance. So we gave a lot of thought to that in putting this out, but we'll continue to do that based upon those kind of comments. So thank you. Who's next? Bill Platt.
Thanks, Marty. Just as I listen to the discussion, I sort of have two observations around this. And this is one area of the proposal that we've spent a lot of time thinking about. And one is the performance of the work. And I think largely I would say that the procedures that are laid out in paragraph 4 may in fact be fairly consistent with what people are doing today and read and consider for a portion of the other information. And when I say that, you really think about the other information. There's other information that is derived from the company's accounting records, was subject to the company's internal controls, and has been the subject matter of the audit. The audit tests have been performed around it. But then there is other information that is not related at all to the company's accounting systems or systems of internal accounting control. And I do think that in 4C, I think would be this characterization of other information not directly related to the financial statements. I don't know that it's clear enough for me to know what I would do as an auditor to that information. And right now, you sort of would say, well, if an underwriter asked me for comfort and started circling a bunch of items for me to give comfort on, I would give comfort on the items that are derived from the accounting records or subject to the internal accounting control, but I would say that the other information is outside the scope of my audit, it's outside of the areas of my expertise, and I wouldn't give comfort on it. So I guess I worry a little bit about this other information and what the expectations are, and are we changing, kind of the performance expectations or standards around that information. And if we are, I think we need to be clearer than this simple reference that's in 4C right now. So that would be the performance side of it. The other side that I have is in the reporting now of what's been done. And we are creating maybe a new byproduct level of service called an evaluation. We evaluated. And to me, I think evaluation implies something more than I considered in relation to the information that I had as an auditor. And I wonder whether or not the report is actually being set up in a way that will create an expectation gap, notwithstanding what the standard requires, which is consideration of consistency, but evaluation getting to a point that one would say that, well, to evaluate, then you must have drawn a conclusion, which might then go beyond and actually start having piecemeal opinions on pieces of information that are in the other. And this might go a little bit to Rick's question about immaterial information. Just as, let's say you had a $10 billion company that had no real estate at all, 10,000 square foot of office space, just happens to be a very virtual company, and it was misstated by 2,000 square feet. It's material to the square footage of office space, but is it material to an investor as you sort of look at that? So I think some of those questions about materiality may actually come into play here if there's going to be an explicit statement that there wasn't an identification of a material misstatement. So I think that those would be my two places that I would suggest further thought around. One is, what do we need to do around information that's not from the either accounting records or subject to the system of internal controls over financial reporting? And secondly, to make sure that we don't create a reporting format that's creating an expectations gap, but truly is providing informative information to users of financials.
Bill, do you have, the material, the paragraph 4C, which you referenced, which is other information not directly related to the financial statements, that could be the example I gave about leading manufacturer of widgets, and the company, purports to be that, but that they're not. They're the third.
So what if?
So what would be, do you have a view as far as should the auditor ignore that, or, kind of what should the responsibility be?
But what if we have two auditors that one happens to know that and the other doesn't? Is the inference that you always should know that? And what happens if, for example, there's a lot of different ways to measure leading. So they manufacture more widgets than anyone else in the world from a unit perspective, but they're the third in revenue because they manufacture cheap widgets and other people manufacture premium widgets. Is that something then that is a material misstatement of fact or not? There are two leaders, depending on what metric you use. You use total revenue, you use total units. I think it introduces a lot of interesting concepts, and I also don't know, I might think that I know that they're third, but I really don't know from my audit, and I only know from other public information that's out there that everybody else can see too. So I think even though you have a simple example, I'm not sure it's as simple in the real world when you really try to apply it.
So I'm assuming, and I'm not sure if it's a correct assumption, that you may be more supportive of the responsibility today, just if the auditor becomes aware of something, but that perhaps I think what I'm hearing is you're concerned about the reporting on that aspect of material misstatement.
For the pieces that go, for the pieces of information that are not derived from accounting records or subject to internal controls, I think I would say yes.
So, of course, we do say, so these are in context of, you should read this other information, and based on relevant audit evidence obtained and conclusions reached during the audit, evaluate things. So it's not requiring you to evaluate that other information not directly related to the systems based upon some new procedures. It's whether or not when you were reading the minutes, understanding the company and its environment, as part of those risk assessment procedures, you became aware of aspects of the company and their position in the marketplace, et cetera, or their growth opportunities or other things that when you finally read the other information, based only on procedures you performed during the audit, the risk assessment procedures and all of that, you became aware of it. So we do have that limiting factor. It may not, apparently not ameliorate your concern, but that was the intent of those words, that you don't perform additional procedures. It's based on what you know. So the answer to your question would be, one auditor might know with respect to a statement management makes that is an inconsistency or a misstatement of fact, and another auditor might not know that because they didn't come upon that in their risk assessment procedures. So that is a possibility that, because it would be based upon what you learned as part of risk assessment. So that is a possibility. But the other point, I think, and you've made a lot of good points there, Bill, there's different ways to understand leading. We just hope that that would trigger a conversation between, if the auditor thought there was a misstatement, it doesn't mean the auditor is going to report that. We just hope that would trigger a discussion, and not hope, the auditor would trigger a discussion between the auditor and management about, let me understand the context in which you've said that. I thought I understood something different, and maybe it trigger a conversation if that wasn't satisfying with the audit committee, et cetera. But hopefully that would be resolved before somebody reported something.
Yeah, and I think those conversations largely take place today, Marty. Just on the point on the other information, though, is, and I think sometimes in terms of a layman, and to say that there's other information that I don't have anything in my knowledge base to know anything about, and therefore I say, well, I don't know whether it's true or not true, but because I don't have any information from my audit to evaluate it, I'm going to be okay with it. And then to characterize that as that you have evaluated, it seems to me to be maybe setting up what I described before as that expectation gap. It's sort of odd to say that that's an evaluation just because you didn't know anything.
We understand your point. Thanks.
Okay, Dan Montgomery.
Thank you, Jennifer. And just getting back to your earlier point on just some input on the usefulness of reporting on other information, and just to give a little bit of international perspective on that, the IAASB did consider the alternative of simply acknowledging in the auditor's report the auditor's responsibility for reading the other information, reading and consider, reading and evaluate, whatever the terminology, and perhaps indicating a responsibility to discuss any issues identified with the audit committee. But the IAASB heard very strongly through 2 public consultations, 3 public roundtables, and a significant amount of outreach, that there is value to an affirmative statement by the auditor in the auditor's report on the auditor's responsibility for other information and the outcome of the auditor's work effort. So just the point in terms of usefulness, the IAASB is firmly committed to moving forward with an affirmative statement on other information in the auditor's report. This was something that was supported by, not only by investors, but there was strong support from regulators, from national standard setters, and from other stakeholders globally to move forward because of the value of that statement in their view. However, I also would point out that the IAASB will continue to look at the wording of the reporting language so as to not create any confusion or misunderstanding, or certainly not further expand the expectation gap, and will be doing so in connection with its further work on finalizing the revision to the IAASB's Other Information Standard, ISA 720.
Thank you, Jan. That's helpful. I see a couple other cards up, and I don't know if they're just up from previously. Steve Buller and Wally Cooney. So, okay. I have, according to my watch, that it's 10:30, which is break time. We've got a 30-minute break scheduled. I wanted to see if there was interest, anybody had any other topics. I see one card up on other matters. So I see a couple. I'd like to take those because I think even if we have a little bit shorter break, we'd still be okay. So Mike Cook.
Thank you, Jennifer. I just have sort of an overall observation about a lot of the things that have been talked about. Sort of the question you haven't asked, and I guess I think it's okay to answer it if you didn't ask it, but it's not a definitive answer. But one of the questions to me, an important question, is cost benefit. What are the costs that we're going to impose by whatever we end up doing, and what are the benefits going to be? I know the economists get involved in that, a lot of other people get involved in that, but that's a very important issue. So I'd like to take the opportunity to comment on that. Many of the people who offer comments say, I appreciate the opportunity to talk about this subject. I've talked about this subject, the auditor's report, for so long I don't know for sure that I appreciate the opportunity anymore, but that doesn't keep me from offering a few thoughts. And then I'd like to give you one suggestion from the perspective of an audit committee chairman that might really produce a benefit with whatever you ultimately decide to do, and I'll save that for the last. As I look at the cost benefit of this, like a lot of things, the costs are more obvious than the benefits. If you accept this will make investors better informed as an overriding consideration that drowns out any cost issues, you can get to that answer pretty quickly. I don't think of it that way, and I don't get to that point. But for me, the cost, the dollar cost of implementing what we have here or some modified version of that is going to be significant. So the benefit has to be significant, and I can't quantify either one of those for you. We will divert audit attention from things that matter in terms of audit quality. We may do it, depending on how this gets implemented, at a time of the year after the end of the year when we need all the attention we can get to the critical things that need to be done to complete an audit. And doing this, critical audit matters, writing them up, getting them reviewed, talking to 14 different people, I don't think is going to meet a standard of adding to audit quality. I think there is a real risk of obscuring the key messages that do need to be delivered. I happen to like the pass-fail. I don't think we are abandoning that, but if you have a hard time finding it, or when you find it, you're not sure that you did pass because you got so many other things in there that might indicate that you really didn't or you barely passed, I think that's a serious issue. I am quite concerned about the issue of original reporting. Auditors reporting things that are not being reported through management, through the financial statement process. I'm very concerned about some of the discussion about disclosure and essentially creating new disclosure standards through a requirement here, such as with respect to material weaknesses and significant deficiencies. I don't think that it is in the prerogative or the parameters of the PCAOB to be writing disclosure standards indirectly. So I would point all those things out as being costs that are of concern to me. Then I get to benefit, and I'll make a prediction on which I can't substantiate, but I think a lot of people might see it the same way, and I've heard it described. I will predict this will become lawyerized boilerplate. And what we are trying to achieve, like a freehand where the auditor gets to sit down and write how they did the audit of company X and what bothered them in doing that, will be totally overtaken by the need for uniformity, legal considerations, and what we will see 2 or 3 or 5 years from now when we look at it is going to be boilerplate that is not particularly informative. I might be wrong. That is my opinion of the way this will play out. And I then kind of put all those points together and say, does it meet the cost-benefit test for you? For me, it does not. And so I just offer that. It's not quantitative conclusion, but I think the need to step back and really ask what costs we're imposing, financial costs and diversion costs and unnecessary information costs, the kitchen sink that we're going to get, which I happen to agree with. When you start adding all those up, the benefits have got to be very clear and very direct. I also would observe, however, that I think this train has left the station, meaning I think I've heard it said often enough in the last day or so, we have to do something. Well, I'm not compelled to conclude that we have to do something if we're not doing something that meets the cost-benefit test and is the right thing to do, but there apparently is a conclusion that we've got to do something here. So if you have to do something, then I would just say, think carefully about the implications of what you're doing. This last discussion about other information is very much on point, I think, with that issue. I didn't really want to get into it because it was being well said by others, but the word leading is not a fact. And if you're leading people, using that word, into challenging that as a statement of fact, there are many accounting firms in the United States who claim to be the leading firm. That's not a statement of fact. Largest is a statement of fact. That's quantitative and could be challenged. It's just an indication of the areas that you can be leading people into that are going to be very problematic. And I like to know about these things as an audit committee chairman. But I'd like to go to one other phrase that is used by members of the board and others. I want to know what keeps the auditors up at night. And this is now my request to you. As an audit committee chairman, I want to know what keeps the auditors up at night. But I don't want to find it out next February or next March. This is my standard pitch. I'm not going to give you the big story about timeliness. And for the auditors to be writing next February or March about what kept them up at night in this year when it's relevant to know that from an audit committee standpoint is not satisfactory. So I would urge you, please, if you are going to go forward with this, either in this standard or by rewriting or amending the standard on required communications with audit committees, provide for this information to be given to the audit committee on a timely basis. I want to know today what's keeping the auditors up at night. I hope they don't have anything like that. But I really am not interested in finding that out next March. And I represent the investors in our company, and I need to know that information now. And I don't see any reason why you can't build a requirement to that effect into whatever conclusions are reached about critical audit matters. But timeliness is very important. Thanks for the opportunity.
Thanks, Mike. Obviously, we will clearly think of and explore the economic rationale behind all of this. We've begun that and discussed that to some degree in the proposal itself. And certainly, as we think about next steps, whether it's a reproposal or adoption, we'll clearly have to articulate the economic rationale of the need for this, various alternatives we may have considered to solve whatever the need is, and what are the costs and related benefits. So that's something that's, without a doubt, things that we'll definitely do that. And whatever we ultimately issue and adopt will certainly reflect a very thoughtful economic rationale behind it. That's part of our mantra to do that. I don't want to cover too many. You've made a lot of good points, and certainly we'll think about all of them. To your point about hopefully no auditors would keep this from the audit committee till the time of the annual report being issued and the opinion. AS-16 has in it already, communications with audit committees, a statement that communications with the audit committee should be done on a timely basis. We can always think of reemphasizing that and making requirements in a different way to ensure that they're timely if that's not occurring, but that's certainly built into AS-16. So this in no way contemplates that the audit committees wouldn't hear about the issues that keep an auditor up at night on anything other than a timely basis. But thanks for the comments. They're valuable things for us to think about.
Okay, I see 3 cards up, so I'll take those and then we'll go to break. But so Bob Hirth is next.
Great, thanks, Jennifer. I had one comment on critical audit matters from yesterday. In the draft standard on page A1-8, item 10, it talks about when financial statements are presented on a comparative basis and talks about where critical audit matters from the prior period might be restated. It talks about for the first time that information is presented publicly, and also where there's a prior period where the auditor's report could no longer be relied upon. I think what's missing there, and I think you might add as a third point, where there are meaningful or significant difference in critical audit matters between reporting periods. What I mean by that is financial statements are generally presented in pairs. And if you only have the critical audit matters of the most recent opinion, you're going to ask me to go back and find last year's opinion, which was the current year's opinion, and look at those critical audit matters. So if I had 5 critical audit matters that were exactly the same between both years, fine. But what if I had 5 in one year and 6 in the previous year, or 5 and some of them were different? So I think you need to ask the question where you have that, should that be considered in the standard? My second point was, we've had a great discussion over the last 2 days, and this is a really, really important change. And to Mike's point, I think on the costs and benefits, I would really encourage the board to think about how you monitor this with, multiple parties, but clearly the investors, the filers, and the audit committees, and get some feedback, but also think about whether or not this is so important that we go back and report back to the SAG in a year or two on what the findings were from those studies on the costs and the benefits. Because this could be a standard that either continues or gets revised, or when you really sit down and look at it and look at all the benefits, they weren't there, and that becomes superseded in some way.
Thank you, Bob. Elizabeth?
Just
go
one
ahead.
comment to Bob's, and that is, we have already announced that after the comment period is over, which is December 11th, we'll analyze those comments, and we certainly have a SAG meeting next May. But we also have already announced that we plan to hold a roundtable, some type of forum to discuss the comments that were received, and a focused meeting just on the auditor reporting model, as well as probably a SAG discussion in May. So we intend to get continued outreach and reaction beyond the many comment letters we get, to make sure that we get all that kind of input you're talking about. So those are valuable points, Bob, and we plan to do that.
And maybe just one step further, so would the idea be, because we have these different parties that have, different viewpoints, would you even think about seeing that a third party does some kind of study, or engaging some third party to really look at the costs and the benefits, a year out, or 2 years out, or 3 years out?
Well, as Jim mentioned yesterday, well, first of all, we have economists on board, and we'll be thinking, as I clearly stated, I hope, that nothing would go forward until we did a thorough economic analysis of why we're doing what we're doing, what's the problem we're trying to solve, and making sure that we're solving it in an economical way. But we're also building the capability in the Center for Economic Analysis at the PCAOB to look at ways in which, after we issue standards, the effectiveness of the standards and the benefits of the standard vis-a-vis the costs. So we want to continue to build that capability at the board. So thanks a lot.
Elizabeth, I had you next on my list.
Yep. Okay, thanks. I just wanted to go back to the point I made earlier, just about the critical accounting matters, and encourage you to be clear in defining that and use the existing standard that's required. So auditors should report the matters that are significant in accordance with the accounting rules. So it's already defined in the documentation standard, and that should be, so going back over what work has already been done, what's already been identified as significant, and then talking about that. So rather than introducing a significant amount of additional unnecessary judgment, we have lots of different perspectives even in just this room, and I think if you're, with all due respect to auditors having lots of different views, I think if you introduce that into this, then it's just going to be a huge loophole that's unnecessary.
I'm not sure I fully understand your point, because you made reference to the documentation standards. So in my mind, I was thinking about the engagement completion document, which auditors document significant issues and findings. And in developing, in the proposed auditing standard, it would have the auditor look to that engagement completion memo, the matters discussed with the audit committee, and the matters communicated to or reviewed by the engagement quality reviewer. And then we have a definition of critical audit matters, which would be helping the auditor to identify not that entire population, but those that are most significant to be communicated to investors in the report, rather than have a lengthy list of everything that might have otherwise been communicated. So I wasn't clear on if you're thinking that our definition as proposed may be sufficient for purposes of communication, or if you're...
No, I think the proposed definition is insufficient because it should say, I believe, that what should be reported is what's significant in accordance with the current standards. Now, not everything, but the completion engagement memo, to the extent that that talks about what's most important.
Okay, thank you, I understand. And Arch.
Thanks, Jennifer. There was an item on the slides yesterday we didn't get a chance to talk about in detail, and that's the documentation. And there's an aspect of that, and again, my firm's still in the process of developing our letter, but one thing I've raised in connection with this documentation is it seems like an extremely onerous requirement to document not only those matters that you have identified and believe are critical audit matters, but those, and I think the words are, that appear to be a critical audit matter, but are not treated as one. So you're trying to document the negative. And the current documentation standard of the board, in my view, is very robust. I'm not aware of anything where we have to document the negative. In other words, we will do a risk assessment, and we document those areas that we feel have a higher risk of material misstatement. We have to document how we respond to those risks. We don't have to document those areas that we don't feel have a higher risk of material misstatement. And that's what this standard is directing us to do from the way I read it. And to me, that's going to lead to a situation where I think auditors are going to get extremely cautious to avoid any second guessing. So I ask you to take a careful look at that and really decide whether that kind of a requirement is necessary here.
I'm glad you raised the documentation requirement. And in developing that requirement, we considered whether it should just be only document those in your work papers where the auditor did report a critical audit matter. Our concern was the determination of critical audit matters is judgmental. It's those that, were most difficult in forming the opinion, most difficult obtaining evidence, had subjectivity and difficulty. So that determination is judgmental. And so if the auditor just leaves something critical off, then what would be the safeguard to prevent a matter from appearing in the report? We thought that if there's an issue that would appear to engagement quality reviewer that would otherwise appear, which is an experienced auditor, to have met their criteria, then that would be and was not communicated in the report, then that matter or matters should be documented so that the engagement quality reviewer would understand the rationale. So we thought having that, kind of requiring the auditor to document it may have been something that was discussed significant with the audit committee, that an experienced auditor would otherwise say that should have been in the report. Why wasn't it? We felt that was a safeguard. We didn't think that the nature of the list would be extensive in our view. And Marty's jumping up, so I don't know if you have anything further to add.
I just want to, you raised a very good point, and we expected to hear commentary on that. And so we're glad you brought it up, and I'm sure it's going to be in the letters. I think Elizabeth's point was require specific things to be reported and have what's reported as critical audit matters based upon specific things that are mandated in our standards that you have to report on all of these things in the audit report. And that's one way to go. And so hers was comment was standards-based, right, rules, pretty much like AS-16, communications with audit committees. Take a subset of that and say these have to be communicated in the audit report. And that's one route to go. The other route was the way we went, which was what was, in the auditor's view, the most difficult subjective matters that he or she faced, But the problem with that is there's a risk that Jennifer pointed out. What's the safeguard that the auditor will not, under pressure or whatever, decide, I'm not going to put this matter in because management and the audit committee doesn't really want me to? What's the safeguard around that risk? And so we had to think about that risk, that could occur, and therefore maybe a documentation standard, that something that might appear to an experienced auditor to meet this standard has to be documented. So we understand your point, that it gets to whether or not we keep this as a judgmental, based upon what the auditor believes are the most difficult matters to be reported, or really change our threshold to say it's mandated that these items have to be reported, and go to what Elizabeth said, just put it in the standards, this has to be reported in the audit report. So that's a threshold decision for us, and the way we put it out in the proposal was one way, but based on comments, we'll reflect on maybe what some others have said, do this according to standards and rules. With that, I think we're well past our 10:30 finish time. Let's try to get a break of 15 minutes and be back here then at about 5 after for the audit quality indicator discussion. And thanks for this robust discussion this morning.
and go after this in depth yet again, and we very much look forward to doing that with you. Before turning it to George, let me just make a couple framing observations about what I thought we got out of the SAG meeting that we had in May. First, as you recall, we came to you with what we thought would be the objectives of the project. You weighed in on that. We brought to you about 40 possible indicators that came with a definition of audit quality, a framework for audit quality that allowed us to know whether we were thinking broadly enough about the possible indicators, and then, as I mentioned, these 40 indicators themselves. You helped us prioritize our thinking. You weighed in on the definition, the framework. You provided a rationale to why you thought certain indicators worked and why others were problematic. You also helped us understand better what the right nature is of these indicators. And by that I mean, I think your counsel was that these need to be fairly broad, a balanced portfolio notion, that they provide genuine insight into audit quality, that they avoid unintended consequences, and that they always be accompanied with context. So just raw numbers without a story behind them would be a mistake. You encouraged us to always be sure we had both numbers and a story when addressing audit quality indicators. You also helped us realize that what audit indicators are not and should not be are grades or formulas or even benchmarks, and certainly not safe harbors. Broadly, you helped us realize that the goal here is to enable folks to ask the right questions about audit quality using the indicators, rather than the indicators providing definitive answers to the questions themselves. And so it's been in that spirit that we've moved forward, and I think it's an understatement to say that the SAG discussion has certainly guided every aspect of the staff's work since then, as you will see in the comments that George offers. So George, if you could walk us through some of the issues that were on the previous slide there, and we look forward to your questions and observations for us.
Sure, thanks, Greg. The board identified the AQI project as a priority for 2013, and our project's objectives really haven't changed since we last met. The AQI project reflects an underlying premise, namely that identifying measures for analyzing the key aspects of quality of public company auditing can offer additional insight for audit committees, investors, and others, and thus encourage the firms to compete on audit quality. Such measures can also inform the board's policy and inspections decisions, aid the work of other auditors, and assist the audit firms themselves in both quality control and remediation efforts. Our next milestone is for the staff to propose a concept release for the board's consideration, and this will most likely occur shortly after year-end. We have thought about the scope of the work on AQIs in 3 broad work streams, which relate to the AQIs themselves, the possible users of AQIs, including examples of questions about how the AQIs will be used. We'll discuss the status of our research and outreach efforts in a moment on the following slides. With respect to our empirical testing, OR is in the process of gathering and qualitatively testing the AQI data. We've met with others within the PCAOB to understand the data that we have available for AQI testing and have compiled a preliminary inventory listing. We are presently in the early stages of quantitative empirical testing and to understand how well various input and process indicators may correlate to results indicators. We have another work stream dedicated to the drafting of the concept release. We've already begun circulating a draft outline for the concept release amongst the other divisions. And as previously noted, we're striving to issue a concept release shortly after year-end. We've engaged in a wide range of outreach. Depicted on this slide is some of the many different resources we've consulted to date. Generally, as Greg noted, the resources with whom we've conversed believe this is an important project and can provide helpful information. However, some have cautioned us to be aware of unintended consequences. We've received excellent input from the SAG members with respect to our tentative definition, the framework, and the rating of the AQIs themselves. We incorporated much of the SAG's and the Investors Advisory Group good feedback and plan to cover some of these revisions during the rest of the session. At the last meeting, we appreciated all the great feedback that we received in both the breakout sessions in which you all participated and the surveys many of you completed. We also analyzed the surveys that you've completed with a handful of surveys from various investor advisory group members, and we received a number of recommendations from a subcommittee of the investor advisory group on AQIs as well. While we've performed much outreach with various thought leaders, we're planning further outreach with select audit committee members and others. Internally, we've been working in close collaboration with Inspections and the Office of the Chief Auditor. We have met with a number of times with Inspections and OCA we've discussed DRI's audit quality improvement cycle efforts and OCA's concept release on changes to the board's quality control standards and how we might leverage possible synergies with the AQI project. The purpose of these series of brainstorming sessions was to obtain additional input from the other divisions. And the next couple of slides cover the process and the criteria that we've used internally to evaluate the AQIs. The staff sought to identify the broadest range of possible indicators, a process that's surfaced over 70 indicators thus far. And the slide reflected above outlines that process. To surface the broad range of indicators, the staff created a quality framework, as you recall, defining inputs of the audit. An example of that would be competent people, control features of the audit process. An example might be inspections of audit work, and the results of the audit, reliable financial reporting. We then considered indicators cited in academic research, previous efforts related to audit quality indicators, and the discussion with the board's advisory groups, the SAG and the IAG, firms, other regulators, audit committees, and others. We've surfaced indicators related to one or more of the different elements of our framework, based in part on input from the SAG. In fact, the SAG played an enormous role in shaping our thinking. As you can see on the slide, that was the very first screen. At our last meeting, we requested you to rank the usefulness of the indicators, and the staff utilized the results on the basis of the first screen on the slide above. And the second and third screens consisted of a cross-divisional team within the PCAOB, which is evaluating all candidates based on a set of criteria. Through this process, the staff is currently narrowing the list to the most promising indicators. Ultimately, we speculate that roughly 10 to 15 indicators may be sufficient to present a balanced scorecard. We expect the concept release will result in many comments that will help narrow the candidates to a viable and useful scorecard. Reflected on this slide are the 11 criteria that ORA used for screening the AQIs. Examples include usefulness to audit committees and investors, potential for unintended consequences, scalability, the availability of data, correlation to audit quality, whether it was a leading or lagging indicator, and whether it provides insight into audit quality. You will recall that with respect to the SAG surveys, we requested the members to rate on a scale of 1 to 5 each AQI based on how useful you believe it'd be to audit committees and investors. For example, many of you recall that Part 1 inspection findings was one of the top ranked AQIs. I believe it received a rating of 4.6. Now, how this contrasts with the, the cross-divisional team within the PCAOB has evaluated all 11 criteria reflected above. Initially, we rated the AQIs as either high, medium, or low, and yes or no for others. We then converted these into scores. While the cross-divisional team score had a more narrow standard deviation due to much broader evaluation of different criteria, as well as differences in methodology used to calculate the scores based on the number of different criteria that we considered, the team's tentative thinking was largely similar to the SAG's. For example, Part 1 inspection findings tied a couple of other AQIs for the top-ranked AQI. We also bifurcated what we perceived to be the most promising AQIs into two buckets. The first bucket is those that we plan to propose without reservation. The second bucket are those which we like the concept, however, we recognize they may present either definitional or implementation challenges. And so we'll be looking for feedback from the public in our concept release. We propose the structure of the concept release in 3 parts. First, we plan to discuss the objectives and the background of the project. Then, in the second part, we will discuss and seek feedback to our revised definition, framework, and our top AQIs we believe are relevant to audit quality. In the part 3 of the concept release, we do not plan to declare ourselves. Rather, we will simply pose a series of questions around the best way to deploy the metrics and seek input on the potential use of the AQIs, including such questions as, should we report the AQIs at the engagement level, the office level, the affiliate firm, or the global firm level? How will the data be collected? How should the information be disseminated? By the board? By the firms? How will the data be used by the audit committees, investors, and others? As well as what are the risk and unintended consequences of reporting AQIs? We welcome any additional input pertaining to the scope and structure of the concept release outlined on the slide above. We received feedback from SAG members in both areas of our tentative definition of audit quality and our tentative framework. We received a recommendation that the definition of audit quality should include the notion of compliance with professional standards more prominently, and as you'll note on the slide above, reflects our revised definition. In addition, we received feedback from you that our framework could be simplified. The tentative plan is that our framework will still be a hybrid between the existing interim adopted QC standards and the COSO framework. However, we do plan to simplify the framework. A number of the indicators scored low on the SAG survey and have been removed from the staff's list of possible indicators, while others have been revised to address SAG member comments. The indicators are a tool to cast light on the strengths and weaknesses of key factors influencing audit quality. The indicators are qualitative, the indicators are quantitative, a factor distinguishing the board's AQI project from other efforts to discuss audit quality in purely qualitative terms. Their power is enhanced when observing trends in the data and when comparing indicators across audit engagements and firms. Indicators are an integrated set of criteria. Therefore, no single indicator is determinative, and while the indicators may not be equally significant, they are designed to operate in a balanced scorecard to provide broad information about audit quality. The indicators are not a formula for determining whether an audit is accurate or fairly presents the audited issuer's financial condition. And as Greg noted earlier, they're not algorithms, nor are they safe harbors or benchmarks. For example, the AQI data always requires context, that is, qualitative analysis of what the data implies about quality. The meaning of the numbers depends on the situation to which they're applied. And reasonable explanations can exist for divergent numbers, and a variety of other factors may affect a particular audit. A critical part of the context, and hence the usefulness of AQIs, is comparability. For example, an audit committee informed about an engagement staffing ratio for its upcoming audit may inquire about how that ratio compares with that for other audits of its auditor and why. The audit committee might also inquire how that ratio compares to other firms. Absent comparable data, the audit committee's ability to evaluate such information may be limited. Deciding on the best use of indicators to promote audit quality requires answers to basic questions. They include, who can best use the indicators? How can they be used most effectively? How should the necessary data be obtained and distributed? The answers to these questions will determine the scope, timing, and potential effect of the project. We expect the concept release will take no position on the questions. Rather, it will identify the alternatives and seek public comment on those alternatives. For example, the slide reflected above identifies the tentative customers for AQIs and how those customers may benefit from their usage. There are alternative ways to provide benefits of AQIs to some or all of possible customers. The range of those alternatives depends on several factors, including the nature of the customers of the AQI is intended to serve, the unit of account, in other words, the entity to which the AQI data relates, the identity of the entities that collect and disseminate AQIs, whether the AQI program is voluntary or mandatory, the scope of the audits and audit firms that are subject to AQI reporting, and the possibility of phasing in steps toward a complete AQI program. The slide reflected above outlines possible options for these factors. The staff expects to issue a concept release early next year to solicit public input on the goals of audit quality indicators, the potential uses of those indicators to promote audit quality. The concept release will include a public comment period, and the board may schedule one or more public roundtables to discuss the release. In the meantime, the staff continues to perform empirical testing and solicit advice on the project. With that, Greg, I'll turn it back to you.
I'd like to invite any questions or observations anyone has. Kevin?
Yeah, Greg, thanks. On one of your slides here with the funnel, at the bottom says public input field testing redeliberation. Can you give us a little color commentary on what you're contemplating relative to field testing?
I'm thinking out loud here. I don't think we have a field testing plan other than we recognize that field testing is an important aspect of this. It could be possible in an AQI program that we start, for example, with a voluntary program at this, to start. Such a program would allow a period of experimentation. We get a lot of experience with this, and folks could report on what's working and what's not working, and we could adjust. So one aspect of a field test could be a voluntary type period of time to do this. Another aspect of field testing could be more traditional type field testing, where we actually take tentative thinking and ask folks to apply it on a sample basis and see what we learn. So that could be part of it as well. We also think that empirical testing is another example of kind of field testing where we have a fair amount of data. I don't think it's going to answer definitively whether certain metrics ought to be in or out, but I think at a minimum we can test whether input and process metrics are correlated to results metrics in a meaningful way. So those are the three things, Kevin, that come to my mind when I think of what we might do in the area of field testing.
And Greg, don't get me wrong, I think that field testing is critical, yet, and let me just express some of my disappointment. I see that the PCAOB is launching the ship that is going to dramatically change the audit reporting model, yet is not conducting any of its own independent field testing. So I'm scratching my head as to why field testing is going to be undertaken relative to this initiative, yet not undertaken relative to the audit reporting proposal, other information, all the things we just talked about that also raise, a lot of cost-benefit issues and other complications relative to implementation.
Well, I'll just comment on that we have not concluded that we will or will not do what the next steps would be in terms of field testing and other information that we'll provide regarding cost benefits. So what we've said is we'll get the comments back in. We received a lot of comments here over the last 2 days. We expect a lot in on the comment letters. Comment period ends December 11th, and maybe some comments will even come in after that. Who knows? We've talked about roundtables in the first quarter, March or so of next year, based upon what we heard, and to get further reactions to the comments that came in. And the next steps after that will be based upon what we think are most judicious under those circumstances. So we haven't really said what we do or ruled anything out either, Kevin.
Mike Cook?
Very briefly, which is very unusual for me. I think this is just terrific. There are audit committees. Doesn't matter how much experience their people might have or their chairs might have or what their backgrounds might or might not be. Everybody needs help in this area. This is a positive step. I applaud all of you who are directly involved in it and the PCAOB. This can really help in dealing with this issue of quality as opposed to other considerations, and I think really move the ball forward. Well done, and keep going.
Thank you. Elizabeth?
Thanks, Greg. I'd echo those comments and also just encourage you to keep the engagement level metrics. Those are pretty critical to be useful to investors. And there have been some talk of the benchmarking fears. I think the fear is a bit overdone. We've got sunlight on a whole lot of various things. We've got SEC correspondence. We've got key performance indicators. We've got I just think that it's useful, and I don't think we have to assume that there's going to be some sort of negative benchmarking. But if the quality improves of the audits and behavior changes in a positive way, that's a good thing.
And just an observation, thank you for that, an observation about the notion of benchmarking. What we meant by that comment is, at least here at the staff level, the board has reached no conclusions on this, but at the staff level we were thinking that we would not say on any particular metrics, here's what we think is in bounds and here's what we think is out of bounds. The market may choose to do that. Audit committees may choose to do that, but we weren't thinking we would do that. So I think we recognize that benchmarking is a function of market participant behavior, but we weren't thinking it would be an aspect of regulatory behavior. Bob Hirth?
Greg, I think I saw the objective on competing on quality, but I think we also want to step back and not forget, I also think a goal would be, or objective would be, to actually improve audit quality, not just compete on it. So think about that, and then thus to see, is it improving or is it degrading? And around that, maybe to think about, is there a baseline that you can determine when you start? So to say, if we're sort of here, whether that's the PCAOB findings or the status of some of those measures to begin with, to track that, and then finally, maybe it goes without saying, so I'll say it, is just ensuring you have the right concepts around standardization and thus the consistency of the information that's reported between firms to get an apples-to-apples comparison.
We certainly had the first and the third point that you make in mind. If we've poorly communicated that, that's our fault, but we certainly have that absolutely in mind, and we need to give thought to the second point you make. Thank you. Scott?
Thank you. First of all, congratulate you. I think you've moved the ball. I understand why you're excited. This is pretty exciting stuff. We've talked about it for a long time. You just made a comment, Greg, about what your intent is, but also we're worried about unintended consequences. So you may want to think about communication plan, because when you get below your objectives internally, you start going externally. You may want to think about how you communicate this different than you've done previously, because there will be those people out there that are going to measure it and going to be other things. So you may want to think about how do you package this, how do you roll it out, how do you communicate it, so hopefully people will understand that. I know it's earlier in your process, but you may want to think about the communication, how you want to do that.
Does anything jump to mind, Scott, when you say that would be different from the normal way that we communicate? Or you have something in mind when you said that, or just a word of caution for us?
Well, it's a word of caution, but it's also, think about NACD and other groups that are out there that you particularly want to reach out to and help communicate. Think with audit committee members hang out, think about the board members hang out, particularly communicate through those areas, maybe even reach out to the business press from time to time and help communicate them, because I think you're going to create a pretty powerful tool here. The issue is how it's used, and you don't want it to be used inappropriately in intent.
Just a couple comments in reflection to several of the comments that have made, and Kevin Riley's comment about field testing. And I think it's critical for us to do some level of testing to know if these audit quality indicators are truly correlated with good or bad results, depending on what the metric is. And the vast trove of our data that we've accumulated over 10 years of inspecting firms is based on what we found wrong.
that our systems historically have only accumulated the negative findings, really haven't accumulated the information about engagements that our staff maybe stepped back and said, well, even though we can't pat anybody on the back, we say internally at least, this is a pretty well done engagement. So a large part of that does this really correlate to engagement done well, a metric that we think is appropriate. We're going to have to rely on a lot of the data from the firms and their assessment of what goes well and find some way to get that to us so we can look at it. So it's on this benchmarking and the unintended consequence and messaging, I think that's all part of it. That because we have not done a holistic test of both directions, negative audit quality, negative event associated with audit quality indicators, positive audit quality indicated with the correlated with the indicators. The message is going to be real important that we don't have the data necessarily to back up some of the things that we're saying are promising indicators. So this is. Greg has said this before, and I will say it again. This is a marathon, Ron, and we're at the starting line.
So just to pile on, just a tad, one of the reasons for excitement on this project is the work that the Inspections Division is doing with the firms on root cause analysis. And that work is, in fact, two-sided. It's not just, let's go figure out why, when it didn't go well, but rather let's look at when it really went well, why it went well. And we've been arguing internally that the root cause analysis project is the flip side of the same AQI coin. So we hope to be informed by that good work, and that could significantly affect these indicators over time. John White?
Yeah, first I wanted to echo Mike Cook's remarks. I agree with everything he said on this. I certainly have heard repeatedly from audit committee members how excited they are about this project in general. One other place that you might want to look is, I'll just call it the intersection with the SEC's, I'll call it Big Data Project. But they are looking, Craig Lewis is leading a significant effort over there that I think overlaps in some ways with this, and I would urge you to look at his speeches and his materials, and he's got a lot of stuff that I think would be very useful to you on this. He presented some of it at the PLI program last week, but I think he's got a lot more behind that he hasn't laid out publicly. In terms of your chart on AQI users, it's a couple slides forward here, but you talk about audit committee use. Interestingly, what I thought I heard is that audit committee members saw this as a way, in terms of use, not just to look to assess risk and audit quality, but really to change the inputs and the processes in their audit to get better results. So I think there's another benefit, in a sense, that belongs there, at least from the audit committee perspective.
John, thank you, and I certainly agree with that second point that you make. On your good point about the SEC, just two observations. Yes, we're speaking regularly with Mr. Lewis, who has been helpful, and I would also like to just put in a plug for Brian Croto's team. They have been enormously helpful to us with their insight in this, and I think it's fair to say, I don't want to put words in your mouth, Brian, but I think you guys are fairly enthusiastic about the promise of this project as well.
Extremely enthusiastic, yep.
Lisa?
Thanks. Just a really quick comment. I would echo what Jay says, that this, the concept of positive reinforcement is really exciting, and I think a lot of eyes will be on your project. In the context of the non-public constituents, my landscape, so to speak, I didn't see FINRA or NASA, the North American Securities Administrators Association, listed among your regulators. Likely they are among the regulators you're consulting with, but I would, to the extent that those are the only other sets of eyes on the audits of the non-public broker-dealers, I would encourage you to include FINRA and Nassau in your circle of friends.
One of the issues we'll raise in the concept release is whether certain constituents ought to be exempted from the program or not, whether certain audits or audit firms ought to be exempted from the program or not. So your comments about broker-dealers and other areas that are, say, outside what typically has been the mainstream of public issuers, I think are particularly helpful and would encourage comment letters in this area. I think we really welcome all the advice we can get on that space of whether people are in or out, and if they're in and they're kind of in a specialty different world, do we need a specially set of tailored metrics for that world, or will general metrics apply? I mean, these are heady issues, but thank you for raising that. Okay, Jerry?
Thank you, Greg. I think this project, from the perspective of an audit committee chair, is terrific and support the comments made. Since I've been sort of a piling on guy here so far, let me not break the trend with this. But in this case, listening to the point, very good point about NESD or the other people you could do outreach with, and recognizing the network you guys have built with audit regulators through IFER and through your own bilateral arrangements. With audits being global, both incoming and outgoing, and the increasingly global nature of the people, the companies that are being audited by the auditors that you are auditing, I guess the question just is to express that would be something that would be very useful to include, and whether you're finding, are you guys in the lead on this? I mean, as you look at IFER and others, the IASB, et cetera, what kind of activity is there in this arena outside the United States?
Well, obviously good observations that audits are global sports, securities markets are global sports, and it's hard to keep an effort like this simply a narrow national focused sport. We have engaged with other regulators internationally, and obviously our dialogue with the firms always takes on a global nature because the firms are global. I think you asked, are we ahead, are we behind? What has differentiated our effort, I believe, as George mentioned, is the quantitative aspect of this. As you know, a number of people around the world have actually laid a very nice foundation about the qualitative things that one would consider about audit quality. Our challenge here is we're trying to see if we can add a quantitative layer on top of that, and whether that helps. I know of no other effort parallel to this that would be quantitative other than, of course, the CAQ in this country has an effort that has a quantitative element to it. That said, the interest by others in this space is high, and I think folks are eagerly looking to see what our experience is, and for all I know, they've already started to undertake their own work. We just may not be aware of it yet, but I'm sure we will soon. As early as next week, we again speak with international regulators, about 100 that are coming to Washington, so that'll be another point of contact for global. But your points about globalness are obviously well taken.
Greg, I'm aware of the fact that you have a speaking engagement elsewhere very shortly. Maybe George can continue on with the one or two cards up there, and then we wrap up. Unless you want to stay here a little longer, but I know you had a sharp cutoff to get to your speaking engagement, and I wanted to accommodate that.
No, thank you very much. And just to observe, some of you already mentioned, this is an engagement that several of us have with leads of large company audit committees under the auspices of the NACD. So it's just a wonderful opportunity to get direct counsel from audit committee chairs. So thank you so much.
Wayne, was your card up? Did I? Oh, I thought I saw that up. Sorry. Greg, thank you very much. Are there any other questions? George would be happy to entertain further questions. Good. Well, thank you very much, Greg and George, for continuing to keep us updated on the Audit Quality Indicator Project and the strong enthusiasm you've obviously heard for that. So good luck with continuing that. The last, next slide that should go up, Brian, I think is the SAG Chairman's wrap-up. And what I've learned over a few years is this should be really, really short. And that's usually appreciated after a couple of days of intense discussions that I'm not carrying on for a lengthy period of time, summarizing and giving my perspectives on life or on what you've said. So I'm going to stay with that. What I will say though is you encouraged us on a lot of areas. You've offered a lot of help to us, and in a lot of areas you've challenged us to rethink what we're doing. And you're helpful to us in all of that. All of that's very useful, and we take it to heart. We have a transcript of these meetings. We go through that transcript on all the different projects that we are working on and carefully examine the statements that were made in thinking about our next steps. So it's not just what was said here. We look at these comments as we march on with our projects and continue or adjust or whatever the case may be. So thank you very much for all that input. I'll just mention that our next formal meeting, our next scheduled meeting, is May 28th and 29th of 2014. That doesn't mean we won't call on you between now and then. We may, including the fact that we've talked about the SAG Fraud Task Force, which we would expect to contact a number of you to express, to understand your desire to participate in that endeavor and move that along early in 2014. I'll take one last shot. Does anybody else have anything they'd like to add in any final notes? Or if not, I don't see any cards going up. I'll take that as you agree with me that the wrap-up should be short, and you've got travels to go to. So safe travels and enjoy your Thanksgiving holidays and the rest of the year, and we'll see you soon. Thank you.